This is going to be lecture number 5. No, it'll be lecture number 4. And this lecture is going to be dealing with the Gilded Age from 1866 to 1900. The Gilded Age was a term that was coined by Mark Twain. Mark Twain called this the Gilded Age because America appeared to be wealthy when it only had a small gold leaf over our society. It was not really a wealthy society during this time period. We had millionaires who controlled everything, but generally the people, the American people, did not have a whole lot to call their own during this time period. The middle class is about 50% of the people. 5% of the people are your wealthy class, and then about 45% of your people will be the poor, and the poor was really a downtrodden bunch. The poor included not only sharecroppers and the former slaves and the newly arrived immigrants. It included a lot of different people here in this time period. The big thing that got the Gilded Age going, of course, was steel. Steel was invented in 1870 by Henry Bessemer. Mr. Bessemer lived in England, and he started experimenting with iron ore and the temperatures in order to smelt iron ore. And he found out if you get iron ore to around 2,500 degrees, it'll turn it into steel, and steel is not bendable. That steel can be used to improve your railroads. It can be used to build your skyscrapers, to build your tall buildings. So the whole Gilded Age is going to be centered around steel and railroads. That's going to be the big catalyst here behind this Gilded Age business here. Okay, it's also the age in which we try to replace labor with machinery. Steel is going to give us the ability to make machines that are precision. They can go a long way in helping us manufacture different items. And of course, these robber barons, these wealthy industrialists, want to find a way to displace labor as quickly as possible. And they believe that by making machines, building various kinds of machines to replace labor was the way to go. And so they're really looking at ways to cut back on labor expense, which is the most expensive thing you have in a business, is your labor expense, and to find a way to cut that cost by putting in new machinery that would have to get rid of all of these employees. The largest corporation in America during this time period was the Pennsylvania Railroad System. The Pennsylvania Railroad System had over 20,000 employees, which is a major corporation for this time period. This sounds like the 20th century corporations. They believed in cutthroat competition, and they believed in buying out their competition. All right, they want to have control of the whole marketplace. Well, this is called a monopoly. And we realize if we have monopolies, we will not have democracy, that our businesses would all be controlled by 1 or 2 people, and that would be the end of it. So we start trying to find ways to pass laws to help regulate monopolies. And one of the first major laws they passed was in 1887. 1887, they passed what is called the Interstate Commerce Commission. The Interstate Commerce Commission. Okay, they were established to regulate the railroad companies, to stop this cutthroat competition, to stop one man from buying out all the railroad companies. And that was the whole idea here behind this Interstate Commerce Commission, to regulate the railroads. Now, here's the question. Is this policy constitutional? Does the American Constitution allow the federal government to write laws that regulates industry, particularly private industry? And of course, the answer is no. But they decided to do this under the Protection Acts for the people. You know, in the 1830s, they passed laws about steam engines. They were concerned about steam engines blowing up, particularly on boats and trains. If a steam engine blew up on a boat,
the whole boat would sink and you'd kill several hundred people in the explosion. So the federal government stepped in and started passing regulations about steamboat businesses, the railroads and the steamboat industry. And so they did it under disguise of passenger safety to keep the American people safe. That's the same thing here. They're trying to find a way to protect the American people. The Interstate Commerce Commission was also concerned about freight rates and how they were charging a lot of money to transport farmers' goods to the marketplace. Sometimes the farmers did not make any money because of the freight rates to send their goods to the marketplace. And of course, the railroads were stealing from them. So the farmers were involved in this type of sharecropping with the railroad companies, trying to get their items, their beef and their pork and their corn and their wheat to the marketplace. And the railroads are charging them such high rates to transport these goods, but they're not showing very much profit. And the farmers were not doing so well because of it here. All right, now here's a real problem about the Gilded Age. I want you guys to remember this. The Gilded Age is a period of time when government backed up big business. The federal government in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s believed their job was to protect the American economy and to protect it by backing up big business. So businessmen had a lot of freedoms, a lot of privileges that they should not have had during this time period. And you see these men get wealthier and wealthier by putting in more lobbyists, trying to get Congress to give them more money, more federal aid, and so forth. And this does take place in this time period. So it's a runaway situation here, guys. The presidents are very weak during this time period. We do not have any strong presidents in this Gilded Age. We have two of them that's going to be assassinated in the Gilded Age. And you could even include Lincoln on that and have three of them assassinated during the Gilded Age. So it's a really an interesting time period here when it comes to big government here and what's going on with these railroad companies and this cutthroat competition that's going on here across America. Now, in 1890, Congress did pass an act trying to bring some stability against monopolies. Monopolies were getting out of hand, and they realized the economy could be hurt because of all these monopoly companies. So they passed what is called the Sherman Antitrust Act. The Sherman Antitrust Act was passed in 1890 by Congress. It's to control monopolies. In 1895, the Supreme Court struck down this Antitrust Act. The Supreme Court said the Sherman Act could not be enforced. It was not fair to the people. Well, here's what's interesting, guys. In 1903, Teddy Roosevelt goes after these multimillionaires. He's tired of them trying to control. J.P. Morgan wanted to control all the Western railroads during this time period. And this president took him to court. They took him to the Supreme Court. And here the federal government is going to use the Antitrust Act, the Sherman Antitrust Act, against J.P. Morgan, and they win. And for the first time, you start seeing the court system backing up the federal government and trying to back up the people against these owners of monopolies, against these big business people here that are trying to control everything. And J.P. Morgan was one of the worst ones of all trying to control. He had more power than the president had in the late 1880s and 1890s. And he had to be reined in. And the Sherman Act is what did it. So in the long run, the Supreme Court struck it down in 1895, but by 1905, they're using it to strike down these monopoly companies and trying to rein in big business here in this time period. Okay, it's also the period of time in the Gilded Age that America has all these great inventors. A lot of these inventors were newly arrived immigrants. A lot of these people who came over to America had lots of talent, and they felt as if they could not do their work in freedom in the countries they came from. So they transported themselves to America. They migrated to America. And they came here, guys, to start setting up shops to experiment, to build new machineries, to build new kinds of communications, find a way to improve the lives of the American people. And so immigration was a major, major issue here in this time period, but a lot of good came out of it with all these inventors. One of my most favorite inventors this time period is going to be Alexander Graham Bell. In 1876, he's going to develop what is called the telephone. And we're now heading more toward the World Wide Web. We had the printing press, we have the steam printing press. We also have the telegraph machine. And now here by 1876, we have the telephone. By 1900, the radio is invented in Italy. It'll be used during World War I. And by 1923, the radio is nationwide. We have radio hookups across the country. 3 years later, in 1926, we have the radio networks. We have NBC, CBS, and Mutual Radio by 1926. Television is developed by 1930. But the Great Depression keeps it from ever being used for any purposes in this time period. It won't be until 1946, after World War II, that the television becomes popular across the country. And by 1954, over half the Americans have got a TV set in their household. So the TV takes off. And then, of course, you're going to have the satellites in space by the early 1970s. And then, of course, you're going to have the World Wide Web developed by 1990s. And here comes all the computer systems. Here comes the new telephones, the new cellular telephones, the smartphones. And so the whole world changed through communication here, guys, starting with the telephone here that's being developed in 1876. 1876 is also our 100th birthday, and America celebrated. We celebrate our 100th birthday, realizing that we are now a great nation, that we have a lot of clout in the world, and that nobody is going to dare mess with us. We have gone through a lot of changes. We went through a civil war, but America is on the up and go. They're up and going here by this time period. And so they decided to have a big circus, or a big, huge pavilion or convention in the city of Philadelphia. Philadelphia was the founding city of the country, and they decided to have the big centennial celebration in Philadelphia. And here, industrial leaders were invited to bring in their pavilions and show the Americans the new technology. And Mr. Bell was there with his telephone. And the people were totally amazed here in this time period. We also had a display of a canal that would connect the Atlantic Ocean, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. And this canal would be built in Nicaragua. Well, this canal was being proposed because in the late 1860s, the Suez Canal had opened over between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. And the Suez Canal had been built by the French. And we figured if the French could build a canal here in Africa or in the Middle East, that we could build one across the Caribbean or across the Isthmus of Panama or Nicaragua. And of course, that canal will be finally funded. It'll cost close to $800 million to build this canal. And instead of going to Nicaragua, we're going to go southward to Panama. And this canal has started construction in 1902. It'll be finished in 1914. And this canal will play a major role in World War I and World War II as America tries to defend itself from foreign influences, from foreign powers in these great wars. Okay? It's also here at the fair in Philadelphia, they show us the big, huge dynamos. The dynamos are machines that are being powered by steam that produces electricity for an entire city. And a lot of your cities are looking toward electricity as the next big thing to be involved in. They have put in sewage systems, they have put in water systems, and now they're looking at bringing in a new kind of power that will light up the night, to give people more hours of leisure time, give people more hours of work time through electricity. And of course, the big thing you need here is a light bulb, some way to bring out the light or turn on the lights once you invent the light bulb. Well, the dynamos are going to be very noisy. They'll be put on the outsides of cities, and sometimes there might be 4 or 5 dynamos that powers a city. But they were going to be very popular here, and by 1900, your major cities across the country have got electricity from these dynamos. Okay, we'll start building power plants during the 1930s, during the Great Depression. So you'll start seeing this technology change here within the next 30 years or the next 40 years, okay? And along this line, you're going to see a gentleman by the name of Thomas Edison. Mr. Edison is going to build a research facility that is called Menlo Park. Menlo Park will be based in New Jersey, and this research area is typically, this is going to be totally designed to invent new items to help the American people. Okay, here he invents a sound machine, a machine that can record and play back the sound off a metal disc. Okay, he's going to invent the phonograph machine. You'll have wax records, which you'll record on these records, and you'll be played back on these phonograph machines. In 1878, he invents the light bulb. It'll burn 13 hours. And by 1880, just a few years later, the areas of Wall Street in New York City have electric lights on the streets and in the buildings. So it's going to happen pretty quickly. As a matter of fact, Edison is going to form what is called the Edison Electric Company. And he'll not only will be powering Manhattan with electricity, he will also be powering the city of Detroit. He'll be heading to Detroit up here. His big person in Detroit to help him with his electric light company is going to be a gentleman by the name of Henry Ford. Henry Ford and Thomas Edison were best friends. And also the two of them get in with J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan helps them finance their research here in this time period. So you got J.P. Morgan, Thomas Edison, and Henry Ford as three of the greatest industrialists of this time period. One man's a financial wizard, the other two are inventors. And so he helps these guys try to make a new America through their inventions here. Okay? Mr. Edison also is going to invent what is called the mimeograph machine. Now, you guys have not seen, I don't think you have seen a mimeograph machine. These machines were your first copiers. You had a piece of carbon paper that you typed out your message on, and you attach it to a drum that was filled with developing fluid. And you had a place where your paper was put in at the bottom, and you turned a crank that turned the cylinder in which the carbon paper is attached to, and it pulled the paper around the cylinder and distributed it on the other side. And you got a copy of what was on that carbon paper. And when I was in school, that's how we got our exams. That's how we did everything, was through carbon paper and through these mimeograph machines. And you'll see them until you start seeing the big copiers we use now to put our exams on. But the mimeograph machine were around until the early 1990s. They were being used in all your schools to make all your photocopies or make all your copies of your exams and so forth, and your instructions for projects. You know, the funniest thing about all this is that developing fluid they put in that cylinder would make you high. It was some real potent stuff. And whenever we got our exams handed to us, the teacher would distribute them across the classroom to us. We'd take that piece of paper and we'd go and smell it. We'd get high off that piece of paper. We took our exams. That might be why a lot of kids didn't do so hot on their exams, because they were too high from breathing that mimeograph fluid in their bodies. But that was one of the things we used to do as kids in school with those mimeograph papers. And I haven't seen a mimeograph machine in a long time. I got some cookbooks back here my mom had collected in the 1950s and 1960s, and they are mimeograph cookbooks. A bunch of women got together and retyped them on carbon paper and made their own cookbooks from their recipes. And I got a few of those back here. Okay, you're also going to see him invent what is called the stock ticker. The stock ticker is going to be used on the telegraph machines, and it's going to send the actual financial numbers to the stockbrokers across the country. That's when you're going to start seeing your corporations have titles that are in letters, like LTD for the limited, DAL for Delta Airlines. You start seeing those abbreviations being used, and below those letters, you'll have the price the stock is being sold at that given time. And so if the market fluctuates and the stock goes up or the stock goes down, you'll get another one in pretty soon to show you what's going on in the stock market. But the stock ticker was very, very important during this time period. You know, all this now is on the internet. If I want to go through and see what my stocks are doing, I just go to Google or go to Yahoo and pull them all up on the financial page. And I got them all listed, and I can find out within a few seconds what my stock reports are. This is a hard way back in the old days with the old stock ticker. Mr. Edison also invents the motion picture camera. Now, that is probably one of the biggest items that he invented, right behind the light bulb. This man invented a camera that could take 16 pictures in a second. He got up to 36 pictures in a second. And all of a sudden, you had scenes of people going about their businesses. You start seeing scenes from the life inside of cities, and it scared people. They didn't know what this was. To have these people captured on film, these lifelike figures captured on film. Well, guys, by 1900, Mr. Edison and his men had gone around the country and filmed what is called actualities. These actualities were pictures of dams, motion pictures of trains going through the countryside, cruise ship lines. They took tours of Florida and showed the fishing and showed the hunting and going and other agricultural pursuits of Florida. They made all these little documentaries. Most of them were 15 minutes long. And they charged them a nickel to watch these programs. And they called them Nickelodeons. The Nickelodeons are your first theaters. They usually had 15 to 30-minute films, usually about a location, Yellowstone Park, the Pacific Coastline, Cape Cod, Destin, Florida, whatever. They had these little films here that you could watch here and see what's going on. The Mardi Gras in New Orleans were very popular, and so forth. And so these people started going to the theaters. By 1912, you start seeing full-length motion pictures. People are being hired to be writers. They start writing scripts. They hire actors and actresses. And by 1912, you're starting to see a real interesting movie production going on in America. Our first major motion picture will be in 1915. D.W. Griffith, a gentleman from North Carolina, is going to take a book called The Klansman. It's about Southern history, The Klansman, about the Ku Klux Klan. And he makes a movie called Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation is going to celebrate the Ku Klux Klan guys, because the book was called The Klansman. And it's a history of the American South and how they are trying to build a new Confederacy. And this movie is 3 hours long. It's the first major motion picture in American history. It had titles, it had subtitles, it had subplots to it, and it's a very interesting movie. Once in a while, Turner Classic Movies, on their Sunday night silent movies, will show this movie, The Birth of a Nation. And it's disturbing, to say the least. They give you a warning about the undertones of this movie and the racism behind this movie. You got to almost have a history lesson before you watch the darn movie, okay? But by 1920, our movies were very elaborate. You had actors like Buster Keaton, you had Clara Bow, you had Joan Crawford. She was a silent movie actress, and you had Charlie Chaplin. You had a lot of these movie stars here in this time period. Gloria Swanson, that became big movie stars here in the 1920s. If you guys are interested in film production or any kind of video or audio work, y'all need to watch those 1920 films on Turner Classics. You can buy them. I have bought the set that was done in the late 1920s by Samuel Goldwyn's company. In this time period, and they're interesting to watch here. They're very elaborate. They're black and white, guys. They're not in color, but the photography is pretty fantastic. It's pretty interesting to watch this stuff. By 1928, sound comes to the movies, and of course, here comes Technicolor. And by the late 1930s, your big movie production movies are being done in color, like Robin Hood, Gone with the Wind, Wizard of Oz, and so forth. And they're very interesting to see these movies done in Technicolor. I think Technicolor is better than digital color is today. And if you watch these old movies, watch a movie called Meet Me in St. Louis. And if you can find it in 4K, get it in 4K and watch it. It's just amazing, the color and the production values of these movies here and the set designs of these movies. It's really interesting here. So Mr. Edison brings in a whole new industry, a new way for Americans to entertain themselves here through motion pictures. Okay? Mr. Edison also is going to play around with early x-rays. X-rays are going to solve a lot of problems for sick people. If you fall and break your leg and they're not sure how bad your leg is broken, they got to cut you open. If you go through and break some ribs, I got to go through and cut you open. And surgery in this time period was a 50-50 ordeal. You had a higher chance of dying from surgery than you did from surviving surgery. And so the x-ray machine allows us to look inside the body to see what is broken and what needs repair before you go in there and start doing the work. So he's very much involved in x-rays. He also is involved in building concrete molds. With the new invention of steel, you can go through and make concrete walls. You got to make your framing, put your framing up, make sure it's at least about a foot wide, and you put all that metal in there to support, or all that steel in there to support that cement, and then you start pouring the cement into those molds to make the walls of buildings. If you guys go to the Niceville campus, the north side of the science building is a solid cement wall. I was at the Collegiate High School working with those guys when they built that building, and I watched them put the molds up out there, and then they started putting in all the rebar and all the materials for inside that wall to hold it up, and then they filled it full of cement. And they had many a cement truck full in there, and had that big old huge spout they use up in the air to get that cement down into that mold. And it's quite an operation, them doing all that stuff. But we do have Mr. Edison playing with concrete molds, and also with architecture in this time period. He also started playing with various kinds of metals, trying to find metals that were lighter weight. This is going to be very important in the 1920s and 1930s as we start building airliners. We need materials, we need metals that are lighter weight. Mr. Edison played a major role in finding the new metallurgy needed to build these new airplanes. So he's involved in all of that. And then he's going to play around with electric trains. A lot of people believe the best way for America to travel is through battery-operated cars and through electric trains. Gasoline was not even considered. It was considered to be too expensive, and therefore the best means to travel would be by battery and by electric trains. Y'all know that Mercedes and Benz and Volkswagen and all these folks in Germany had perfected a battery as early as the 1830s. And by the 1890s, they are building electric cars over in Europe. But Mr. Ford here in Detroit, Michigan, started playing around with internal combustion engines, and America decided their best choice was gasoline. What if we had started with battery-powered cars and electric-powered trains and never deviated from it? It'd be a whole different world today than what it is, just by those two things happening here. Okay? In 1884, we're going to see the construction of our first skyscraper, and it's going to take place in the city of Chicago. I want you guys to realize Chicago was an up-and-coming city during this time period. Chicago was really established back in the 1830, 1840 time period. It's not a very big place. There's a fort there in the colonial period of time. It never did grow anywhere or do anything until New York absorbed Manhattan. When New York absorbed the whole island of Manhattan, you had nowhere else to go. And a lot of your people in Manhattan who had not quite made it are going to go to Chicago, like Mr. Marshall Fields. He had a big department store, and he moved over to Chicago to build his big store, his big department store. Richard Sears, who worked for the railroad companies, began to sell watches on the railroads using a telegraph machine to get orders. And he, in turn, is going to build a big mercantile house, a big catalog house in Chicago. So you start seeing this happen. And then here comes Mr. George Pullman, who's going to build train cars, the luxury train cars for all the major railroad companies. Here comes Armour, here comes Swift in the meatpacking industries. These people are the ones who developed Chicago. And of course, y'all all know in 1873, part of the city burned down, and it came back as a phoenix. It regrew, and this new construction of these skyscrapers are the results of that fire. They decided to build the city in a modern way. Let New York City be the old place. Let Chicago become the up-and-coming place. And so they built the first skyscraper out of steel. It's going to be a 10-story high building, and it's going to be owned by the Home Life Insurance Corporation. The Home Life Insurance Corporation. The architect of the building was named William Jenn, Jenne. William Jenn was the architect of this building. And you're going to start seeing Chicago start building the skyscrapers. All right. By 1900, New York City, which was rebuilt in the 1830s, is ready for urban renewal. And here, after 1900, you'll see New York City tear down buildings and put in skyscrapers. And of course, the most premier skyscrapers of the time period were the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building, which were completed in the late 1920s and the early 1930s for the Empire State Building. And so New York becomes the capital of skyscrapers, but Chicago is where it was really tested and found out to be a suitable way to build. All right, so remember the growth, the vertical growth of cities here. All right, people would say, can we go to the sky? And skyscraper says, yes, you can. You can build to the sky, you can touch the sky. And then the next question was, can we go into space, and will space be friendly to us? Can we live in space? In the 1960s, in the space age, we proved that you can live in space. We proved that our plants can grow in space. That if we have to leave this planet, we can build a humongous spaceship, something like 10 miles long and 20 miles wide or whatever, and get it into space and go to a new homeland within 25,000 years. That's a lot of time going across space. We can produce our food, and we can make it by doing so here. So nothing is impossible here in this time period. If you can dream it, they can try to build it. And that's the great thing about the Gilded Age here. They were always trying to improve what they had. Then, of course, you have the inventor whose name is Henry Ford. Mr. Ford is the head of the Edison Electric Company in Detroit. In his spare time in his backyard garage, he is playing around with internal combustion engines. Okay? By 1900, he has produced over 4,000 horseless carriages. 4,000 horseless carriages. In 1908, he brings out an automobile that he calls the T-Model Ford. The T-Model Ford. This car will cost you about $1,200 to purchase. $1,200 is about the average yearly income of a middle-class family. You look today, the price of cars are pretty much close to the income of an individual in America. So $26,000 for a car is not unheard of. Some people will pay $40,000 for a car. Some people go through and pay $60,000 for a pickup truck. And hopefully that's how much money they make each year. So they can pay the darn thing off in 3 or 4 years and not be in debt for 10 or 12 years trying to pay off a vehicle that's going to be tore up and have to go buy a brand new, and it's going to cost even more money. So it's a vicious circle with these automobiles. Okay? Mr. Ford will invent the T-Model Ford in 1908. And it comes in any color you want it to come in, as long as it's black. That's the only choice you had, was a black automobile. Okay, and by the way, Richard Sears got in with Mr. Ford, and Mr. Ford sent cars to Chicago to be sold through the catalog, through the Sears catalog. And you could order your car through the Sears catalog, and it came to you on a flatbed car on the train. Then unhook the cars behind that flat car where the car was sitting, and they would put some 2x12 lumber up there and drive your car off of that train, off that railroad car. That'd be kind of a tedious, I don't think I want to do that. And tear that car up, it falls off the train. So, but that's how they delivered them here in this time period. Okay. In 1912, Mr. Ford is going to start what is called the assembly line, in which he uses conveyor belts to transport the parts of the car to completion. It starts off with the chassis. You have the bare frame of the chassis, the bottom part of the car. The car goes over to the next area where they put on the brakes. And then they put on the wheels. And now the car can be rolled. And then they'll start dropping in the engine. You get it all hooked up, the transmission, get it all hooked up. Once the motor part of the car is completed, the power source is completed, they'll drop in the passenger compartment, put in the seats, the fine upholstered seats, the carpeting, the whole 9 yards, and then it'll go to the final place where the body is dropped on. Your hood, your fenders, your roof, the whole 9 yards are dropped onto your car, and the car is pretty much finished within a couple of hours. Before, they were hand making the cars, and the men were doing various jobs throughout the day as they put the cars together by hand. With the assembly line, the same person does the same job over and over again. So it becomes extremely fast as people learn how to do the job better. The price of cars went down from $1,200 down to $375 a unit. And now the American people can afford to buy a car. Okay, and they take off. Y'all know by 1920, we had close to 10 million cars on the dirt roads. 10 million of them. You had Ford, you had Chevrolet, you had Buick, you had the Dodge Boys, you had Oldsmobile, you had Buick, you had Overland, you had Packard, Studebakers, all these old cars. When I was a little boy, I would see these cars pretty regularly on the highways because a lot of these cars were built until World War II. World War II, they cut off production of cars during the war. They built tanks and Jeeps during the war. In 1946, the cars came back. Well, a lot of the teenage boys in high schools and junior colleges would buy the old 1930 cars. And so you saw the Packards and you saw the Studebakers and so forth. They were not really in production before 1960. And so I got a chance to see all these old cars. If you guys like seeing old cars, y'all go to these car shows and see them. There's some amazing cars out there that have been rebuilt. And on the internet and also on your cable television, you have various channels that features the old cars. And I have one here that features the old British cars, and I enjoy watching them, showing off the Austins and the other cars out of England during this time period, the Bentleys and the Rolls Royces and all those cars. It's interesting to watch all that stuff and see how beautiful those old cars actually were from this time period. By the way, I got a film clip on Blackboard for you guys to watch that deals with the 1920s in New York City, and it has a lot of scene of the traffic and the cars in New York. And I think you guys would enjoy looking at the old limousines and the big cars they had back in this time period in New York City. So y'all do look for that little film to watch. And I got some great little films for you guys to watch on Blackboard, and I think y'all enjoy watching them. I watched every one of them, and I was just totally amazed at what I could find to help y'all understand American history and actually see it and not hear me tell you about it or give you the stories about it. Okay? So Henry Ford is going to be the major inventor of the automobile, and by 1929, not only do we have highways that crisscross the country, these are asphalt and cement highways, we have got close to 30 million cars on the road. People are on the road traveling by the late 1920s. Another group of inventors that are important in this time period will be Wilbur and Orville Wright. These two young men live in Dayton, Ohio. They build bicycles. You know, it's hard to imagine that the airplane industry began with bicycle builders. William Boeing was a bicycle builder in Seattle, Washington. So a lot of these people who worked on bicycles, the way to get around in the 1890s, early 1900s, the bicycle was the way to go. If you had a bicycle, you was freewheeling. You could go where you wanted to on a bicycle, and nobody could keep up with you. And so the bicycle became extremely popular during this time period. Well, they took the framing of a bicycle and how the bicycles were put together, and they started trying to apply aerodynamic theories to their bicycles. And they came up with an engine that could produce about 75 horsepower. And they take off to Carradale Hills, North Carolina. And here they're going to test out their airplane at a place called Kitty Hawk. They went to the Outer Banks of North Carolina because they had better winds out there, and the plane would need winds for lift. They built a catapult in which their first airplane was catapulted into the air. It flew 120 feet, about the length of a Boeing 737. And here comes aviation. All right. Your first president to fly an airplane in one of these early rickety airplanes is going to be Theodore Roosevelt. Teddy fell in love with aviation, and he loved the airplane. He was the first president to fly an airplane. He's also your first president who died in a submarine. So Teddy Roosevelt was on the edge here of adventures and trying to find out about the workings of these new inventions of the time period. In 1910, the United States Congress is going to appropriate money toward aviation. They believe that the United States needs to invest in aviation that could be an up-and-coming industry here. They formed what is called the National Advisory Committee, for Aeronautics. Okay, their initials was NACA, almost like NASA, like NASA, okay? And their job was to study flight. Well, in 1913, they put the study of flight into the United States Navy. United States Navy. In 1913, they're going to commission a special area for the study of flight. It is going to be the Pensacola Naval Air Station. This is 1913. If you guys have not been to the Pensacola Naval Air Station, to their museum, you need to go. That should be on your to-do list, because that's a very interesting place to go to. Pensacola's got some really good museums. You got the Winthrop Museum downtown. You got lots of museums in Pensacola you can go and visit. They go to Mobile to their museums. It's only 2 hours from here to Mobile. And there's like 47 museums in downtown Mobile. And they got a beautiful art museum out on Springdale Avenue, out on the western part of town. So you got lots of things to see here, guys, locally. When it comes to museums, go to Montgomery to their great museums. There's a lot of stuff to do in this area within 2 hours of us here. And you can go spend the day up there and pack you a picnic lunch, and or go to one of those fancy restaurants in Montgomery that serves the soul food, the original soul food, and enjoy yourselves in these 3 cities that are close by to us here. So in 1913, the Naval Air Station is opened in Pensacola. In 1914, we get our first airline company. It is based in Tampa. It is called the Tampa Airboat Airline, and they fly across Tampa Bay to Clearwater. All right, the flight takes 18 minutes. The airplane will carry 3 people. The airline will last about 4 months, and they lost nobody and they lost no luggage. And this airline was first tried. One of the first major air carriers we have in the world is going to be KLM, the Royal Dutch Airlines. Antonio Fokker, a Dutch aviator, he was called the Flying Dutchman. Antonio Fokker built airplanes, and he started building airplanes for airline companies directly after World War I. And his Fokker planes had 3 motors in them. They were called tri-motors. They had one under each wing, and they had the one in the nose of the airplane. And these planes could carry 8, 12, up to 19 passengers in the later editions of these airplanes. The first was only carrying like 8 people. And they started an airline company over here in Holland as early as 1919, 1920. And so aviation is up and coming during this time period. What really made aviation popular was World War I. World War I began off with water-cooled engines and airplanes and struts and all kinds of crazy drag items on board your airplanes. And after World War I, we go to air-cooled engines, which are lighter weight, and we start using aerodynamics to form our wings and get rid of all the struts. We find ways to cover the engines. We find a way to make the planes more aerodynamical, and the planes could fly faster. And in the early 1920s, a lot of your aviators from World War I will come home and buy airplanes, and they'll start what is called a flying circus. and they'll put on all kinds of shows with trapeze artists and wing walkers and all this stuff. And they'll do all kinds of dives with smoke coming out of the tail of their airplanes. They'll do all kinds of tricks here. All right. When the air show ends around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, these aviators would allow people to ride in their airplanes. And for $10, you could go on a 20-minute sightseeing flight. And a lot of people across the country had their first flights after a flying circus performance. One of my most favorite of the flying circus guys is Roscoe Turner. Roscoe Turner was from Corinth, Mississippi, and he got a contract with the Gilmore Oil Company to represent him, to pay for his airplane and for his flying circus, to help him out financially for advertising the Gilmore Oil Company. And the Gilmore Oil Company's trademark was a tiger. I'm sorry, was a lion. And old Roscoe went off and got him a cub, a lion cub, a live lion cub, and that cub flew in his airplane with him, going across the country for air shows. And the lion was named Gilmore. When Gilmore got too big to fly, he got another Gilmore. So the man had a way to promote himself by flying these lions across the country in open air cockpit. I want to see y'all get your cat into your car with the windows all rolled down. You're going to see Crazyville take place right there. Imagine having a lion in there with you, okay? It took a lot of training to get that lion to sit down in that airplane and behave himself, okay? Talking about an unruly passenger. He'd be an unruly passenger on board that airplane, okay? But the airplanes took off in the 1920s. People across the South started building airfields. They used their cow pastures. Over in my grandma's hometown, the McGee's had a flying circus. Mr. McGee owned a big dairy company. He produced milk here and butter and cheese and sour cream in the whole 9 yards. And once the cows were all milked and moved from the pasture land to a feeding area, they took off. And they had a flying circus here. And they did quite well with McGee Flying Circus here out of Mississippi in this time period. So you start seeing all these interesting things take place. Well, also in 1920, the boll weevil comes to America. The boll weevil is a bug that eats the fiber of the cotton plant. When the cotton plant blooms out and begins to form the fiber, and inside those bolls, the boll weevil came in here and ate up the fibers. And it started destroying the southern cotton crops. Well, over in Monroe, Louisiana, were a bunch of old country boys who were farmers. Some of them had degrees from the A&M schools, and they started thinking about a way to make it better to grow cotton. They had put nitrate on the back of mules to spray on the crops to kill the boll weevils. Well, this nitrate was so powerful and so strong that it peeled the hide off of your mules. Your mules died. You can imagine seeing a bloody mule with his hide all pulled off his body. It's pretty bad. And so they went over to Macon, Georgia, to the Haviland Airplane Company, and they built what is called a crop duster. And here in 1924 and 1925, they started crop dusting. And they crop dust all across the Mississippi Delta, between Belzona and Memphis. They sprayed across the southeastern part of Arkansas, around Pine Bluff, and they sprayed up there in northeastern Louisiana, out there around Monroe. They started crop dusting, and it made a big improvement here on the cotton production. They were able to kill the boll weevils with new chemicals that were being used during this time period. Well, one of the men who worked for this company was named C.W. Woolman. And Mr. Woolman decided that he wanted to start an airline business. So he goes and he buys what is called a Travel Air airliner. The plane had a single engine in the nose. It had a high wing above the fuselage, and it held 12 passengers. And he bought a couple of these Travel Airs. And he started an airline company. It was based in Monroe, Louisiana, and it flew out to Dallas-Fort Worth, stopping at about 5 cities along the way, like Shreveport and Longview and so forth. And then on the other side of Monroe, it flew to Jackson, Meridian, to Birmingham, Alabama. And he named his airline Delta. That's where Delta Airlines was started. In 1940, he started buying DC-3 airliners. These were 21-passenger airplanes that had dual engines, had one on each wing. The plane was extremely popular. The plane only cost $45,000 to purchase, and he moved his operation to the Atlanta airport, to Atlanta, Georgia. And the original hangar that they built in 1940 is now being used for the Delta Air Museum. You guys get a chance, you're going through Atlanta, turn off on Virginia Avenue. This is off Highway 85, Interstate 85, heading northward. Turn off on Virginia Avenue. It's just past the airport, and you'll come into Delta's big campus. And here in the campus, you'll see signs that will lead you to the Delta Air Museum. If you got little kids or teenagers, they will like going to Delta Air Museum. That's lots of neat things for the kids to do, lots of hands-on. There's flight simulators in there. There's all kinds of neat things in that terminal, in that old hangar here from this time period. So guys, the airline companies are going to be around starting around 1924. And you'll start seeing them develop. Delta comes along in 1929. And so you'll start seeing the developing of airline companies all during the 1930s. Y'all know at one time we had over 125 airline companies in America. This was during the 1940s and 1950s. They've all been merged together, and we're down to about 8 of them. You look at Delta Airlines genealogy sheet of all the airline companies, it's a lot of them. There's a bunch of airlines that are in Delta today. And I got a poster over here of these companies, and it's amazing how many companies are inside of Delta Airlines and their operation today here. So aviation is going to be up and coming here, starting in the latter part of the Gilded Age, and you're going to see the airline industry progress all through the 1930s. As a matter of fact, President Franklin Roosevelt believed that airline industry might be a way to get out of the Depression. He says we go through and get several hundred airplanes in the air and have several dozen airline companies, and they hire 200 or 300 pilots and 200 or 300 flight attendants, and they have close to 1,000 people in maintenance and on the ground and terminals and so forth. It might be a way out of this Great Depression. We might go through and hire 1 million people just for the airline industry. And so it's promoted very heavily during the 1930s. And by the end of World War II, the airline business just takes off. And by 1957, 1958, we're going into the jet airliners. And with the jet age, the airline companies do take off, because you'll soon see the 707s and DC-8s for long distance flights. You'll have 727s, 737s, and DC-9s for short range flights. And by 1968, here comes the Boeing 747s. They'll carry almost 500 people across the world. And so you'll start seeing a major change take place after World War II. And there's a lot of boys who got trained to fly during World War II, and a lot of boys might become mechanics in the early 1940s. And so when the war ends, they have jobs with these airline companies. Okay? In 1865, the annual national production of the United States was $2 billion. In 1865, the annual national production is going to be $2 billion. In 1900, it is $13 billion. So the Gilded Age is going to go a long ways in building the new American infrastructure, the new American economy in this time period. And here are some of the corporations that were around in 1910. These are major corporations in 1910. And how many of these corporations do you still identify with? The first one was U.S. Rubber. U.S. Rubber made hoses and tires for automobiles. You had Goodyear. They're still around. They make tires. They also made brakes during the early days. You have General Electric. A lot of you guys have got GE washers and dryers in your homes. You've got GE refrigerators and dishwashers and microwave ovens. All right. GE was a major corporation. I was a little boy. My mother only had GE products. Today it's LG. Back in this day, it was GE. Now everybody's going to Samsung. So you have these different companies that are going to be evolving, and GE was the first one who got things going. Matter of fact, GE's most popular products in the 1920s will be the refrigerator that's powered by electricity. You'll also have the freezer. For the first time, you can kill a hog, and instead of putting it in the smokehouse to cure it, You can put it into the freezer and freeze it. You can freeze chickens and fish and all kinds of poultry. All right. You can go through and buy a side of beef and have your freezer full of beef. You can go deer hunting and have a freezer full of venison. It's not unusual. And some families would have 2 or 3 freezers because they did not buy meat. They had chickens, they had hogs, they hunted white-tailed deer, they go pheasant hunting, go get those quail, and they'd fill their freezers with this kind of meat. I look at my little household. I spend $100 a week on food just for me, and about half of that is for some kind of meat. You can't buy anything much for less than $20 for a piece of meat. You buy 3 pieces of meat, you're gonna have a $150 grocery bill that week. And that's where the expense comes from. Here, these folks didn't spend a penny for meat. They had their gardens. They didn't buy anything at the grocery store, but mostly coffee and flour and sugar. That was it. Everything else was grown on the farm in this time period. City folks had to buy from the grocery store, but these country folks, they didn't have to worry about that at all. And by having these freezers, they could freeze all kinds of vegetables and all kinds of meats and have plenty of food on hand by doing so. Okay? Another big company is going to be Westinghouse. They too are still in business. Westinghouse now and General Electric to a certain extent now are known for building jet engines for airplanes, for airliners. GE makes a great engine, and so does Westinghouse. Westinghouse also was involved in the appliance business, making various kinds of electrical appliances here in the beginning of the 20th century. Here comes Nabisco. Y'all eat those townhouse crackers. Y'all eat those Oreo cookies. You know, y'all know who Keebler and all these guys are. And Nabisco plays a major role behind all of this fast food industry, or these cookie industry here of the time period, potato chips and corn chips and so forth. So here comes Nabisco. You had Swift and Armour. They're the ones who are the meat packers. If you guys eat potted meat, it comes from Swift or it comes from Armour. Okay, if you eat beanies and weenies, it comes from this company. If you go through Vienna sausages, it comes from these companies here. If you go through and you eat Vienna, not Vienna sausage, but the Spam, it comes from these companies here, guys. So Swift and Armour were separate during the early 1900s. Now they have now merged together, and they're one big corporation. All right. Then you have General Motors and you have Ford Motors. That's your 2 big motor companies. You can add to that the Dodge boys. They're still around too. Okay? So these are our 3 big automobiles. Buick is still with us. All right? And those are your big ones, and they're still around today. And then there's Eastman Kodak. You know, when I was a kid, actually until the last 15, 20 years, all we had were film cameras. You didn't have digital cameras. You didn't have cell phone cameras. You had to go through and buy a camera that used film to make the pictures. And Eastman Kodak was the premier film corporation for the United States. We all had a Kodak camera. All right. My dad had one that he bought after World War II. And he had a viewfinder in the top, and it had 2 lenses on the front, and you looked into the viewfinder to make your pictures. And the negatives were big negatives. They were not those little bitty ones you see from these little 210 cameras and so forth. They were pretty good sized negatives. The camera was called a Brownie, and the people across America love their Brownie cameras. And we used them regularly. Birthday parties, Christmas, New Year's, Easter, egg hunts, the whole 9 yards. Dad had out his Brownie camera. And I'm glad he had one to have all these pictures from my childhood. I can look at and remember those good old days when your parents were still with you and your families were tight-knit, and we were extremely tight. It was extremely loving and close during that time period. Okay? And Kodak made the pictures of America. Well, in the 1970s, Eastman Kodak developed what is called digital photography. And they made a camera that was a 30 megapixel camera. The camera was designed just for professional photographers. And they made a few thousand of them, and they stopped making cameras because they didn't see a marketplace for digital cameras. And they sold their patent to the Japanese. Canon and Sony got their patents for the American-made digital cameras. And what have they done with the digital cameras? I've got a Canon 50D digital camera. It's a 17 megapixel camera, and it makes beautiful pictures. I don't use it much anymore because my little cell phone camera does just as good as my big camera does. Why tote around a 10-pound camera? You got this in your pocket. So I've kind of changed my old ways about how to make pictures. But Eastman Kodak messed up, guys. If they had made the digital cameras in the 1990s and the 2000s, they would still be in business. They're trying to come back today. They were based in Syracuse, New York, and when they went out of business, Syracuse had a major economic turndown. Major. So remember these giants here: U.S. Rubber, Goodyear, General Electric, Westinghouse, Nabisco, Swift Armor, Eastman Kodak, General Motors, Ford, Buick, Chevrolet, all these folks, okay? Now, I want to give you some retail operations that were still around today that from this time period. And these retail operations where you went to buy your goods. The first one, of course, is going to be Sears and Roebuck. Sears is kind of on the downside right now. I hope they might survive, but I don't see it happening. But Sears and Roebuck was here. You had Montgomery Ward's. Montgomery Ward's was like Sears. They carried anything you wanted. They had a catalog that you could subscribe to. You also had J.C. Penney's that had a catalog, and you could order out of their catalog. And these were the three big stores in downtown. In downtown Pensacola, we had a Sears on Palafox, and we had the Penny store on Palafox Street. Across the street in the square was the San Carlos Motel, a big, huge Gilded Age motel that they decided to tear down in the 1980s because the building, they said, has structural problems. It took them 2 years to tear the darn thing down. It was well built. They should have remodeled it and kept it, and they did not do it. Okay, but downtown you had these different businesses. You catch a train in Crestview, unload down there where the Civic Center is today. That's where the train jet depot was. Get on the streetcar, go about 5 blocks down to Palafox Street, and you were in shopping headquarters. You could have it all right there together. And Sears and Penney's was down there. And that's one of our major things. You know, you had to have 6 people on the train to go with you, carry all the stuff back to the train. That's how much stuff you bought. You had everybody carrying 4 or 5 bags, somebody toting the dang box. All right? So you had plenty of shopping going on down here. You had the A&P grocery store. Now, A&P is still around. They're not as prevalent as they once were, but A&P was your major grocery store. You also had the Piggly Wiggly. The Piggly Wiggly was founded in Memphis, Tennessee in the early 1920s. Do y'all realize in the early days of grocery shopping, you had to go to the grocery store like you went to the post office? You stood in line waiting for your turn at the counter. At the counter, you gave that sales clerk your list of what you wanted in groceries. And they went to the back of that building, like they're going to get your mail, and they'd pull all the items that you wanted to purchase that day for groceries. It'd take them 40 minutes sometimes to get your order filled. And they'd come up to the counter with several big boxes of all your groceries. You paid them, and you left the building. Piggly Wiggly changed all this. Piggly Wiggly says, let's go through and display the groceries on the main floor. Let's put in big, huge bookcases. Let's put in big, huge shelving to house all of these groceries on, and have the person get a little cart or little basket and go through the store selecting what they want. Let it be self-service. And let those sales clerks be behind the cash registers up front to ring them out, to send them home with their groceries. So Piggly Wiggly changed the grocery business. Now today we're back at this thing again. We can go through an email or call Walmart or Publix or whatever and give them your grocery list, email it to them, and they'll call you in 2 hours and say your order is ready. You get in your car and you go to the curbside service and you pick up your items and you pay for them with your debit card or your credit card, and you come home with it. So we're starting to see us go back in the old direction. Do you know that my grandmothers ordered their groceries and had them delivered to the house? When I was a little boy, my mother would call the grocery store. It's about 4 blocks from the house, and she'd make her grocery order. And about 30 minutes later, here come a kid, usually about 15 or 16-year-old. He's on a bicycle. He's got a little wagon behind his bicycle, and there's a box full of mom's groceries. And there's a sales receipt that she has to sign that he carries back to the grocery store so they can give her the credit for those groceries. And then she'll write a check a couple of weeks later and send that back with him to pay off the grocery bill. So, guys, we're going back to the old days, the how we used to go and buy groceries because of this pandemic that we're living through. Another big company that was involved here was Woolsworth, a drugstore. They're still around. You also had Brooks Brothers, who sold men's suits. Well, out at the outlet center in Destin is Brooks Brothers, and they do sell men's clothing out here at Brooks Brothers. You had Macy's in New York. You had Belk in Charlotte, North Carolina. You had Riches in Atlanta. You had all these big department stores, okay? You're going to have Abercrombie and Fitch. They sold sports wear. They sold hunting wear to men who want to look nice on the hunting fields. Yes, they sold hunting breeches and boots and long sleeve shirts that had the leather on them, so you could get stuck in a briar patch or in an entanglement of some kind. They made all these clothes. They made clothes for fishermen. They made fish baskets. Okay, so you have all of these folks in the same time period. So America's retailing, America's industries are already in place, guys, by 1910. By 1920, we're here to stay. Okay? Our national fuel policies were based on steam. We're being powered by steam. Those dynamos that produce electricity are producing steam to produce the electricity. Today in Okaloosa County, Northwest Florida, Gulf Power has still got the steam plant over in Pensacola that provides electricity for us here in Northwest Florida. If you go across the Interstate 10 bridge and look out toward the middle part of the bay, going across the bridge, sometimes you'll see big coal barges heading toward the Escambia River to unload the coal up there on the north side of University of West Florida, where the Gulf Power generator is located. And we use natural gas, and we still use coal to generate our electricity here in Northwest Florida. So coal and steam are your fossil fuels during this time period. By the 1920s, coal will be replaced mainly by gasoline. Okay, you'll start seeing more gasoline being powered here in this time period. You will have coal being used, but it won't not be used as heavily as it had been in the late 1800s. But that's our fuel policies. We also are trying to find a way to attract consumers, trying to get people to buy the products. And here at the turn of the century is going to come your advertising agencies. The first major one was called the Ayers, A-Y-E-R-S, the Ayers Agency. And they're going to use various kinds of psychology and sociology and other kinds of persuasion to make you want to buy a product. Remember, this is the time period of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. And we're looking at psychoanalysis. And can you go through and make people want something through promoting it in a way that attracts their psyche and tells them why they need it, You might need it at all, but they're going to try to convince you why you had to have that product. And so they're going to start using photography. They're going to use artists. They're going to use billboards, particularly on the new highway systems. They're going to use radio after 1923 to sell these products to people on the radio. All right. You're going to have magazines and newspapers. You'll have all kinds of pamphlets. You'll have direct mail pamphlets that come to you in your mail, and y'all still have this. I get a thing from Sam's about every 3 or 4 months. I get a little catalog from Sam's that's featuring their items of the season, and that's part of this direct mail way of doing it. These political campaigns, they're sending out all these one sheet heavy papered advertisements of why you should vote for a person. And it's all done through direct mail. So this is all being used here to convince you why you should buy these items. Okay? Now, one of the biggest things about the Gilded Age, and I mentioned this earlier, is the division between rich and poor. America had 5% of the people who are extremely wealthy. Extremely wealthy. And these people call themselves the American aristocrats. The American aristocrats. As a matter of fact, if you go through and look at the stats from this time period, 12% of the American families controlled 80% of the nation's wealth. 12% controlled 80% of the nation's wealth, which means that 88% of the American people, 88% of the American people controlled 20% of the American wealth. So the gulf between rich and poor is very wide in this time period. You had the super wealthy and you had the people who lived on the dirt, who lived on Skid Row. They had nothing to show for anything. They worked hard all day. They didn't make enough money to even have to make a living. They lived in slums. They were faced with all kinds of pandemics and diseases. It's a mess out here, guys, in this time period. These multimillionaires believed in the gospel of wealth. The gospel of wealth is going to involve social Darwinism. You know, Charles Darwin says the best animals are the ones who evolved. The weaker animals would die away and the stronger animals would proceed onward. That's what these people believe. They believe that they were the best humans on earth because of social Darwinism. That God had made them wealthy, the gospel of wealth, and so therefore they're the best people on the face of the earth. That sounds like Adolf Hitler and his fascist regime of the time period. Okay? Then you have the gospel of property rights. These owners of industry, these owners of railroads and so forth, and sharecroppers, they believe that their land was their land and nobody could do anything that deviated from their rules on their land. In other words, you had to obey everything they told you or you could lose out. You could be thrown out of the factory town, be thrown off the sharecropping farm or whatever. Okay? They believe what is called the gospel of property rights, and that individuals who live on their property have no say because they own the property. The owners of the land own the property. The people who live on that property have no rights. That's the gospel of property rights. I want you guys to remember that. So a lot of people are going to be disenfranchised over this ruling here or over this procedure of the gospel of wealth, social Darwinism, and the gospel of property rights. I look at old Andrew Carnegie. His family came to America in the late 1830s. He's a little kid. He's about 8 years old. They came from Scotland. They had absolutely nothing. And the whole family got involved in the sweatshop industry. At age 12, Andrew decided he wanted to go to school. So he goes to school, and in school, he starts learning about the new web of telegraph operators. And he decided that he wants to be a telegraph operator. That's an IT job of the day, guys. It pays good money. And so he learned how to operate a telegraph machine. By the mid-1840s, he gets a job with the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. And his manager tells young Andrew to save your money. If you make $5 a week, you need to spend $2 for food and for clothing and for rent, and then have $3 left over to invest. And he told Andrew to invest in the Pennsylvania Railroad Company, up and coming. Well, during Civil War time period, Abraham Lincoln and Congress took over all the railroads. They used them for transporting supplies and men to the war fronts. But the railroads got great profits because the federal government gave them lots of subsidy payments to operate their railroads. In 1870, Andrew Carnegie, a poor boy from Scotland who's now in his early 40s, has got over $1 million in the bank. He saved that much money in the investment, return on his investments. And here comes Henry Bessemer with the idea behind making steel. And Andrew Carnegie begins the Carnegie Steel Corporation. His big customer is the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. By 1900, Andrew Carnegie is worth $400 million. Unable to spend all that money, he decided to give the money back to society. He built hotels, he built concert halls, he gave money to colleges, he built libraries across the country. He gave back. I don't see today's guys doing this. I don't see them. Bill and Melinda Gates does give back money, but it's not to the degree that Andrew Carnegie did. All right? But he did give back. He wrote a book called The Gospel of Wealth in 1900 and said that God had blessed him with great wealth because he was good to his employees. Y'all go under that fake news and read about the Homestead strike in Homestead, Pennsylvania in 1893, where the Puritan Army came in, a private army hired by Andrew Carnegie came in and killed a bunch of workers. Transported all the other workers off the property, kept all their belongings in their homes in the whole 9 yards, did not pay them anything, ran them off and hired a whole new group of people to work in the steel mills. You see different stories when you go under the surface here, guys, and you start reading about these people and what they're up to. The other famous men I want you to know about are going to be J.D. Rockefeller. J.D. Rockefeller controlled 90% of the oil industry. His big partner, of course, was Henry Flagler, who came to Florida with his sick wife. After she died, he started building the railroads down the east coast of Florida and the grand hotels. So Mr. Rockefeller and Henry Flagler are part of this group. Don't forget James Buchanan Duke of the tobacco industry of North Carolina, or R.J. Reynolds Tobacco in North Carolina. They were part of this big, huge American aristocrats group. You had J.P. Morgan, the financial wizard, the man who invested money in Mr. Edison and in Mr. Henry Ford, J.P. Morgan. Then you had Cornelius Vanderbilt. Mr. Vanderbilt is going to build roads, railroads, and shipping lanes. He gets heavily involved in all of this. And this just kind of sketches the surface of some of the top men. In the lecture notes, in lecture number 4, I have a whole listing of these millionaires and what they did. And on your exams, you might find a matching area that matches these men to the industries that they were in charge of. So y'all be aware of what they're up to here, and y'all use that listing I got on your lecture notes to do that with. All right, these wealthy men believe in segregation. It's not Jim Crow like the other people have across the country. This is personal segregation to keep them away from the middle class and the poor class. Okay? They don't have anything to do with the workers and their plants. They keep themselves segregated from their workers. In society, they do not hobnob with the little people. Okay? In their life of wealth, they have grand homes. Look at old George Pullman. He went through and built a utopian train industry there in south side of Chicago. He put up brownstone houses for his workers to live in. He had several different kinds of stores. He had all kinds of restaurants and commissaries and all this stuff. He built a utopian city for his workers to live in. And people were impressed by what they saw here at the Pullman Train Car Company. But did Pullman live there? No, he did not. He lived in downtown Chicago. He lived in the upper parts of town. His house was close to 13,000 square feet. Those brownstone houses were good to be 1,200 square feet. Mr. Pullman had a big, huge palace on Fifth Avenue in New York City, the center of financing, the center of trade. And he'd go to New York City from time to time in his private railroad car and go live several months in his Fifth Avenue house. The house was mainly boarded up mostly the rest of the year. He had a house out in Nantucket, a vacation house. And sometimes these millionaires would have 4 or 5 vacation houses. They'd have one out in Boulder, Colorado. They'd have one on the Pacific coastline. They'd have one on the Atlantic coastline, Jekyll Island, and out here in Georgia. It was a big, gilded millionaire housing area. They had big old Victoria houses out here they'd come to and stay in during the summertime. And so these guys were totally segregated. You didn't know where they were half the time because they had 4 or 5 houses they lived in across the countryside. Okay? They're going to form their own private clubs. Chicago had one in downtown Chicago. Swift and Armour and Marshall Fields and George Pullman and all these guys would go up to their own club. There's about 45 or 50 of these millionaires that belong to this social club here in downtown Chicago. And they pretty much ruled the city. They pretty much mandated what the mayors and the police department and everybody else was going to do from this club up here. And it's private. And in these clubs, you had inside trading. And a lot of these men were on the board of directors of various corporations. Their kids did not play with average kids. Their kids went to boarding schools. They went to prep schools, and then they went to major universities like Harvard or Brown or Yale or Dartmouth. A lot of these kids went to Oxford and Cambridge over in England. The fathers could afford it. They'd send them over there. Okay, so the kids were totally segregated from their peers in this time period. And they looked down upon the poor children of America. Thank God I'm not in that class. Thank God my father is wealthy, and so forth. Okay, these folks would also travel to Europe, usually once a year. They would go through and charter a steamship. They might take some of their friends from their club with them. You didn't see the poor people on board these ships. You didn't see the middle class on board these ships. They were on their own. They were in their own class here. Y'all seen the movie that had the Titanic and how the wealthier bunch lived on the Titanic? Well, that's how they went across the Atlantic Ocean during this time period. And they'd spend 4 or 5 weeks in Europe. They'd buy all kinds of cooking utensils. They'd buy furniture. They'd buy paintings. They bought the original artwork out of Europe. That's how come the art museums in America now has original paintings of Van Gogh and all these other great artists from this time period. Okay, Peter Paul Rubens and all these folks. Okay, so guys, the wealthy class are totally segregated from American society. They do not want to see the poor. They try to avoid seeing the poor. They want to look European. And a lot of these families did their genealogy work, and they had false genealogy. They made a lot of this stuff up. A lot of them said that they had come from lords and barons. They had the bloodlines of kings. So therefore, they're nowhere like the rest of the Americans are. Okay? This is your wealthy class. This is your top 5% of Americans. Then you had your middle class. The middle class were small business people. They were tradesmen. They were plumbers, electricians. Plumbers and electricians were the up-and-coming job. That's where all the money was in this time period for middle-class people. They were professional people. They were doctors and lawyers. They were school teachers and preachers. They were also middle managers in factories and supervisors in factories. They made a wage. They did not make a salary. They made a salary, not a wage. They made a salary and not a wage. Okay? These folks wanted to look as if they were wealthy. So they built Victorian homes with porticos and verandas and all this stuff, towers on their houses, because they wanted to look like the wealthy. But they couldn't afford to build a 13,000 square foot house. Their house is more like 2,200 square feet. There's more like a doll house than a wealthy house. Okay? And in these homes, the women were the guardians of the house. It is called the cult of domesticity. The cult of domesticity. The women were in charge of the house. They're the ones who selected the furniture and the curtains and the rugs and the pillows and the bedsteads and the bedspreads. They outfitted their kitchens. To help them with their houses, they had magazines that had photographs of how your house should look inside. And sometimes they had colored photographs in these magazines. And you could sit there and dream and wish of what you wanted in your household. These middle-class women also had black help in the house. They would have these women who'd come in and cook and clean and wash clothes and all this stuff. They had the men who came in, the black gentlemen who came in and did the yard work and took care of the gardens and all this stuff, took care of repairs of the house and all this stuff. The women were in charge of the house. The men were the breadwinners, and they had the jobs as being supervisors and vice presidents and managers of businesses. Which means that these women had lots of time for leisure. And they joined the church missionary groups. They worked for social reform groups, organizations. They try to find a way to help out the poor. The middle-class women's agenda was trying to save society. The wealthy class did not care. The middle-class women were involved. And these church women, these Methodist, Presbyterian, and Baptist women were heavily involved in social reform in this time period, trying to find ways to clean up society. You know, these ladies also bragged about each other or bragged to each other. I'm going to get a brand new couch. I found me a couch down at Marshall Fields the other day. It's a beautiful couch. It's going to be delivered this afternoon. Why don't you come over and look at my new couch? Well, that pissed the other girl off. The other lady, she wanted a couch too. And so she'd go down there and look at that new couch that she'd fallen in love with, and she'd come home. She'd tell them, the cook, make a big dinner tonight. When hubby got home, she brought him his slippers and his robe, and she took care of him, and she loved on him and let him read his paper and all this kind of stuff. And then she fed him. He's in there enjoying his dessert, sitting on the couch. She comes in next to him. She says, honey, we need to talk. That's the most dreaded words in a man's life. Honey, we need to talk. And he says, what's going on? She says, well, Mrs. Jones down the street's got a brand new couch. And it sure is pretty, and I want one. Well, he says, well, honey, this couch here, it's only 2 years old. Yeah, but the dog has slept on it. And I don't know how clean that old dog is. And I want a new couch. This is a leather couch, and it won't smell like a dog. It's not going to be a fabric couch like this one is. It's going to be a good, high-quality leather couch. Well, he doesn't give her satisfaction that first night. 4 or 5 weeks goes on, and the persuading gets more personal. And all of a sudden, he's going to change his mind. He'll go and buy that couch for her and give the other couch to a church or to a poor family or whatever. Just get rid of it. This is called keeping up with the Joneses. You want to have items in your household, furniture, plates, whatever, that is suitable for your neighbors to have. If your neighbor gets a brand new T-model Ford, or they get a brand new buggy, or they get a brand new stove, you better look out, because everybody's watching to see how soon that you're going to buy one too, to keep up with the Joneses. Okay? And that's still true in America today. You go to your friend's house and they got a brand new Playboy station, or they got a brand new computer or a brand new laptop, and you get jealous and you want one too. So you start saving your nickels and dimes until you go down to Office Max and buy you a brand new computer, a brand new laptop. Okay? All right? The middle class in America love their leisure time. These folks normally work about 45 hours a week. They're not working 90 hours a week as the sweatshop people are working, or the industrial people working in the actual mills making products. They work about 45 hours a week, so they have leisure time. They love going to the beer gardens. The German folks have come in and they have opened up beer gardens. And they're usually open squares in between the buildings. It's like a patio. And they have entertainment, they have food, and they have beer. And you'll go here. They love going to the nightclubs and the taverns. Yes, women started going to nightclubs with their husbands, mostly to dance. And of course, they started having the pretty drinks in these nightclubs, having the fruity drinks and so forth. They love going to the fairs. Now, this is fair season here in the fall. I'm doing this in the fall of 2020. And people love going to the fair. Walton County just had their big fair. Pensacola State Fair starts this weekend. Actually, it started yesterday. And we love going to the fairs. When I lived in North Carolina, I lived in Raleigh, I'd go to the North Carolina State Fair. It was amazing. I had never been to anything like it since. It's just an amazing fair to go to. And we love going to the fairs. We had the World's Fair. We had a World's Fair in 1876 in Philadelphia. We had a World's Fair in 1893 in Chicago. We had a World's Fair in 1903 in St. Louis, Missouri. We had a World's Fair in New York in 1939. We had another World's Fair in New York in 1964. And Americans love going to the World's Fairs here to see what's available across the world. You know the fact about this, guys? The first time American people had Thai food and Korean food and Filipino food and Japanese food and food from around the world, Indian food, was at World's Fairs in the late 1800s. The Chicago's World's Fair was well known for its food that came here and the different cultures who showed up from around the world in Chicago. St. Louis brought in all this great new food. They'll go to the ballparks, to the football fields, and we still enjoy it as our snack food, as our junk food. It's just part of it, guys. All right? We love going to baseball games. By this time period, your major cities had all baseball teams. They played against each other. They had stadiums that were made out of wood. They had wooden stadiums. They could seat about 3,000 people in these wooden stadiums. They used lots of gingerbread for the decor of these buildings. This is little fans you see on corners of buildings and little artwork that you'd see attached to the wooden banisters and beams. That was called gingerbread. They had a lot of that going on. And we loved going to the baseball games. By 1910, we're going to football games pretty regularly. You know, the first college football game was in 1869. By 1890, Ole Miss, Alabama, Florida, Auburn, Vanderbilt, LSU, Arkansas all had football teams. I said Ole Miss in 1993, we celebrated our 100th birthday of Ole Miss football. So we loved our football games and going to the football games. We started playing golf. Golf became a very popular sport between mainly the middle-class working men. On Saturdays, they'd get together as a group and have a company golf tournament. And they played against each other in these tournaments. Or they bring another company in and have them play against each other. We love playing golf. They love going to boxing matches and watching boxing. They love going to wrestling matches. And at the wrestling matches, they said, is it real or is it fake? They had vaudeville shows, comics, singers, actors, short skits, dancers, jugglers, dog acts, monkey acts, you name it, they had it at vaudeville. And they would have their big program on a Saturday night in the Opera House. Opera was a seasonal thing. but vaudeville was year-round. And so they worked the schedules around the opera houses to have these big vaudeville shows. Vaudeville is still on television, guys. It's things like American Idol, Dancing with the Stars. So you think you've got talent and all this kind of stuff? Or so you think you can dance? This is all part of the old vaudeville traditions. But they did it all together in one big show and not doing an hour at a time on television. All right, we had what is called Tin Pan Alley. This is the music out of New York City. The musicians up here would put 10 strips on the hammers that are attached to piano keys. When a hammer hits the chords on the piano, it makes a real soft, mellow sound. You put a 10 on these hammers, it gets clangy sounding. And they love that sound of the 10 on the hammers of the piano, and they called it Tin Pan Alley. This is where Broadway is born. Broadway is going to be established as early as 1905 in New York City. And these musicians begin to write music and musical comedies and musical performances for the Broadway shows. These composers included people like Irving Berlin, Cole Porter, Ira Gershwin, and George Gershwin, the two Gershwin brothers. It's going to involve Frederick Lowe, Rodgers and Hammerstein, Rodgers and Hart. Richard Rodgers and Lorenzo Hart wrote some real interesting music in the 1920s and 1930s. When Lorenzo Hart died, Rodgers got Hammerstein to join up with him, and they started writing musicals for Broadway. So all this music that you guys have listened to and have heard from the past is coming out of Tin Pan Alley. On those documentaries on Blackboard, those film clips, I've got lots of Tin Pan Alley on there for y'all to listen to. So you can hear what these musicians sounded like. And our music today is very much like it was in the 1920s. There might be different lyrics. There might be more colorful lyrics if you want, but it's still along the same lines of what the music was like here in this time period. And we love this. With the Tin Pan Alley, with the writers of music in New York City, is going to come the sheet music. They're going to start publishing the music, the actual music, on paper. You can go to the music shop and buy the sheet music. If you want the song from Annie Get Your Gun, you can buy it at the music shop. If you want one of Cole Porter's songs, Night and Day, for instance, you bought it at the music shop. And the music stores usually had a male and female around the piano. Usually the young man would play the piano and the young girl would sing the song that you wanted to purchase. You'd hear it sung several times. So you got home, you can try to play it on your own. And a lot of families had somebody in the family who was a pianist, be it a boy or a girl. And then on evenings when you're kind of bored, they'd get around the piano and they would sing. Singing around the piano was a big thing when I was a kid. My grandparents loved to get around the piano and have everybody sing. By the time I was 14 years old, I was through with that business. I'd leave the house. That's too embarrassing for me to even put up with, much less go through and sing those old hymns and all those old songs they want to sing from the 1940s. I wasn't into all that. I want to hear some Beach Boys. I want to hear some Moody Blues and some Boston and some Elvis. I didn't want to hear that mess from the 1930s. I didn't care for it during that time period. I like it now, but I didn't care for it back in those days. Okay. And then of course, Sunday was a day for church. We had what's called the Blue Laws. The Blue Laws made it illegal to have businesses open during church. Most communities had their shops and their businesses shut down all day on Sundays. I remember this, guys. You couldn't go shopping on Sundays. We'd go to church, go to Sunday school, go to church, get home, eat dinner. Then a bunch of us would go into it, tell our parents we're going to go to a study group because we're not allowed to go to the beach on Sundays. You could not swim on Sunday. That was sin to swim on Sundays. And so we'd go to so-and-so's house, And all of a sudden, we're heading off to the beach. We'd get home about 4 o'clock. We'd be there about 2 hours or so. Get home about 4 o'clock, get showered up, get cleaned up, go back to church for youth choir practice. Then we'd go to training union, being a good little Baptist boy. And then we had our church services that usually got through about 8 o'clock in the evening. Well, then we'd all load back up again, parents not knowing what we're doing. We're going to somebody's house for a social. Y'all be home before midnight. It's a school day tomorrow. Or be home before 11 o'clock. And we'd take off and go down here to Foreland Beach, down here to Shalimar, or down here to Ocean City, where the Grace Tabernacle Church is located, down here in the middle of Fort Walton Beach next to Simcoe Bayou Bridge. That was a theater. And we'd go and watch movies. We'd be at church listening to the gospel and watching R-rated movies. Half hour later, down at Simcoe Cinema. Crazy stuff here. All right. But the blue laws were in place until the 1980s. You could not buy liquor. You could not buy. The drugstores were open before church on Sunday mornings for a sick child to get medicine. Usually around 4 o'clock, the ice house would open so people could get ice to make their iced tea and make their ice cream and so forth with. They're seen as being a necessity, the ice house was. But otherwise, everything was shut down. So when we planned our beach trip after church on a Sunday, we've already been to the grocery store on Saturday and got all of our drinks and all of our chips and all of our food stuff we wanted and got it all loaded in coolers and iced down. And we just threw them in the back of the car and we took off. And we was ready to go. And we ate on the beach. We had a good time down there. We did all kinds of fun stuff on the beach. And it's just part of it. But society says you cannot have any kind of fun on Sunday because it's a holy day. I kind of wish we'd go back to the blue laws so everybody would have a day off each week. Let us work extra hours during the week and have Sundays off. It's just crazy how it is today when it comes to Sundays. Okay? Then you had the laboring poor. These were the people who worked in mill towns. They were factory workers. They worked in sweatshops. They were child laborers. They were sharecroppers. They lived in railroad towns. They lived in mining camps. These were your working poor. They did not make enough money to support themselves. Okay? The owners of industry began to study the work habits of their workers and how they put items together. They brought in a gentleman whose name was Frederick Winslow Taylor. Frederick W. Taylor watched hand movements and how you assemble, and he found faster ways through hand movements to make products faster. They believed in what is called scientific management, to make you produce more by how you perform your work duties. And the worker says that you're not doing anything more than turning us into machines, that you are turning us into machines. And so therefore, if we're the machines who make your products, we should have profit sharing. We should get money, extra money, for how we put your items together, because we are your machines. If they would allow these people to have profit sharing, they'd been more middle class and not be in the laboring poor group. Okay? Do y'all know that 53% of all wage earners in the Gilded Age were foreign born? They're not United States citizens. Many of these people were Catholics and lived in ethnic neighborhoods and in city slums. The Catholic Church was being a fearful force in America during this time. People are scared of Catholics, guys. As early as 1850, we had a political party called the Know Nothing Party that did not want Catholics to come to the country, to keep Catholics out. They said if enough Catholics come to the country, the Pope's going to show up and we're going to lose our democracy to the Catholic Church. And the 1920s Ku Klux Klan. That Klan had an agenda against the Catholics. The Catholics were put in the same boat as Black Americans were put in, and Jewish Americans. They're scared of Catholics during this time period. All right? So these people are looked down upon, And they're not protected by the Constitution because they're not United States citizens. And a lot of folks will treat these people as if they're indentured. White slavery. Indentured. Okay? And then you have the poor. The poor have no property rights. They have no land to call their own. They try to rent in slum dwellings. They live on Skid Row. A lot of these people are homeless. If you're homeless, you're called a hobo or a tramp during this time period. And you had the young people who are fleeing the countryside, trying to flee sharecropping and the convict lease system, trying to get to urban centers to make it. And they arrive in the cities with only a couple of dollars in their pockets. They can't get anywhere. So the poor makes up about 45% of the American people in the Gilded Age, and they have nothing to call their own. They're living out here on Skid Row pretty much here. I want to ask you guys a question. If you're a young boy or a young girl, and you leave the farm, going to the urban centers, trying to find a job in one of the big industries or in one of the big slaughterhouses, whatever, and you don't have any money, what do you do? How do you make it? Well, in this time period, they started what is called the social gospel. The social gospel was a movement in which Christians would come together of all denominations and try to find a way to bring a solution to the problems of industrialization. And they started what is called the YMCA and the YWCA. The YMCA is a Young Christian Men's Association. The Young Men's Christian Association, and you had the Young Women's Christian Association. And what they did was they bought abandoned buildings. And they turned the buildings, usually about 4 or 5 stories high, and they made small bedrooms in these buildings to house 1 or 2 people to a bedroom. Downstairs was a lobby, a seating area, a reading area, or maybe a small library. They also had the commissary there. Okay? Or they had a mess hall there. And these young kids would come in from the countryside looking for a place to go to, and they would discover the YMCA and the YWCA. And these young boys would go to the YMCA, the girls would go to the YWCA, and here they met kids just like them. Downtrodden, no jobs, no future, trying to make a go of it in the large urban centers. The idea here was to bring the kids in here, feed them, get them clothes, get them clothing that was suitable for job interviews, feed them and house them, let them have a place to shower and to take care of themselves. And hopefully within a couple of weeks, they'll find a job and move out for the next kids who are waiting to get in. It's a revolving door here at both centers. Well, you know, these kids found kids just like they were. And they start forming their own new family groups. A lot of these boys found the girls across the street, the YMCA or the YWCA. They started dating each other. They're eventually going to get married and start their own families. And all these kids who are together here become a new nuclear family, a family made up of friends. I want to ask you guys a question. Who's your best family? Your family or your family of friends? Who's going to take care of you if you get in trouble? Mama's going to get mad at you, and she's going to cut you off. But your friends won't. They'll give you a place to sleep. They'll help you out until you get yourself started again. If you don't get yourself started again, they're going to throw you out on your butt. So you got them. You know how your friends are. You're going to have to do what they tell you to, but they do take care of you. All right? So here comes a new American family that is made up of different groups of people who come together, build these friendships, build their families, they stay together, and they're always friends. They're always together. So you see this happening here in America. Here are these new groups who come together here, mainly around the YWCA, the YMCA. Now, guys, these two organizations were only for white children. They're only for white children. If you were African American, you went to the Black Baptist Church or the AME Church, the African Episcopal Church. And these church members would take you into their households and give you a place to stay while you look for a job. The black church took care of the children who came out of sharecropping to the north. If you were a Muslim, you'd go to the mosque, and they would take care of you. If you were Catholic, you would go to the Catholic church, and they would take care of you. If you were Jewish, you'd go to the synagogue. If you were Asian American, you would go to the temple. If you were Hispanic or Latino American, you would also go to the Catholic Church. They started what is called the social gospel. The social gospel's slogan is, what would Jesus do? If Jesus walked among us here in the late 1800s and saw all these social concerns, what would Jesus do? And so they're trying to build a society around the scriptures, trying to find a way to help people out. The social gospel is a faith-based social reform movement of the late 1800s. And we still have this today. It is still around today here. And from this group of people, they're trying to find ways to clean up society. One of the first major problems was spouse abuse, child abuse, to make sure that drunken men, and men did drink a lot of liquor during this time period, that drunken men were not beating their wives and their kids, to give them protection. They're trying to end abortions. 1 out of 4 babies are aborted in this time period. 1 out of 4 babies are aborted during this time period. Midwives did the abortions. Doctors didn't do it. You didn't have health clinics during this time period. They're going to come a little bit later on. But abortions were done by midwives, and a lot of women died from abortions. And what did a lot of people say? Well, she killed that baby. She deserved to die. Okay? They're trying to end alcoholism across the country. You got the temperance movement. They're trying to clean up child labor and make sure that children have a chance for a childhood. You know, we don't end child labor until the 1930s. It's a long time before child labor is going to be cleaned up in America. All right? You want to go through and regulate sweatshops to help out those working ladies who work in the sweatshops. We're trying to clean up prostitution. We have 300,000 working girls in America during this time period. And these girls are involved in prostitution. Every city's got a major section of town that deals with prostitution. It's a mess out here, guys. We have tuberculosis that is spreading across the country from the breathing of air pollution. Tuberculosis is a killer. It's a pandemic during this time period. We have the flu that rips through the slums on a regular basis. We have cholera that is caused by bad drinking water, bad sewage disposal. You know, guys, in a lot of your cities, when it rained, all that manure off your streets washed into your rivers in which you got drinking water. And 3 or 4 days after a big rainstorm, your drinking water was a smoothie. It's full of all this manure and all this waste off of the streets. And people died from it. It's horrendous. Here comes Washington Gladden, a major Protestant reformer. And he says if America does not clean herself up, that we're going back to the Dark Ages. They will fall back into the Dark Ages. Edward Bellamy wrote a book during this time period that looked at the future of America and what America could look like in the future. The book is called Looking Backwards. The book was written in 1890. The book takes place in 1980. He's writing a futuristic novel that takes place in America in the 1980s. He's living in the 1890s. He told the American people in his book that most folks will not live in houses anymore. They'll live in large apartment houses, condos, if you will. He says that when a child is born, they're kept in the household, they're taught by the parents or homeschooled. There will be some kindergartners for the more wealthier children, but children will basically learn their colors, their numbers, their words, and so forth by age 4. By age 5, they're going to a kindergarten. And then they spend 12 years in school to be educated. After 12 years, they can work for 2 years, either in the military or in some kind of a civil organization that helps people like the Red Cross. Then they can go to college because they'll know about what they want to do once they have served their country or served in social reform. After 4 years, they'll go to work. At age 40, they'll retire from work. They'll have enough money to live off of until they die, usually around age 60. All right. He says that in these condos that we live in, there will be devices on the wall that will show us pictures and will play music. He discussed the radio and the television. He says that people will not eat at home, that they will order out and have food delivered to them. Or they will go to the shopping centers that are enclosed and go to their food courts. He discussed the malls. This man has no idea what's going to happen in the 1980s, but he's writing about what did take place in the 1980s. Y'all go read this little novel called Looking Backwards. It's on the internet. You can go to and type up Google and it'll come up for you. It's on about 90 pages. It's not a very big novel. The other big novel of the time period is called In His Steps. Him being Jesus. In His Steps is written by Charles Sheldon. And Charles Sheldon is writing that America should be looking at how to handle the downtrodden, the poor, in the same way that Jesus did. His novel begins in a church, a Protestant church in Kansas on a Sunday morning. The minister gives his sermon. When the sermon has ended, he has his altar call, and a young man comes up who is nasty. He is dirty. He smells terrible. And he tells the people of the church that I need help. Can you please help me? And nobody turned a hand to help him, not even the minister. Around midnight that evening, the minister started having nightmares, and he woke up, and he decided to go find that young man. And he crawled through and went through downtown, looking and searching, and he finally found him in an alleyway. And in that pastor's arm, that young man died. And the story is, in his steps, what would Jesus do? They're preaching a reform movement here in which the American people cannot depend on their government. All they care about is big business. They don't care about the American people. They care more about the economy than they are about the people. They're not concerned about pandemics, guys. Our children starving to death, or children being in sweatshops. They're not concerned about that. They're concerned about the almighty dollar that comes from being the president and being a congressional member and having lobbyists and getting kickbacks and using the army to put down labor unrest. They're not concerned about the American people here. And Charles Sheldon says the people have got to come together and make the change happen. In other words, you've got to vote and put people in there who are responsible, who will care about the American people. You know, that's why these presidents in the late 1800s are called the Wizard of Oz, because they didn't do anything for the American people. They just cared about their own little political group and their multi-friends of millionaires they could take care of. These people, this 70% of the people in America were totally ignored. They just didn't care about it. Okay? And because of this comes a rise of labor unions. The first major labor union was founded by William Sylvis. That's spelled Sylbis. He started what is called the National Labor Union. The National Labor Union is going to be made up of skilled laborers. And close to 80,000 men will join this labor union. Now, this union is formed around 1865, and it is for skilled male laborers. Mr. Sylvis dies in the early 1870s. When he dies, his labor union goes with him. And then here comes the next big union. It's called the Knights of Labor, the Holy and Noble Knights of Labor. Terence Powderly, and that's spelled Powerdley, Terence Powderly, in 1885, is going to form what is called the Knights of Labor. He'll have close to 110,000 members, mostly males, in this labor union. And they start making demands of the wealthy class who employs them. They make demands for labor against these robber barons, against these multimillionaires who own these corporations. The first thing they want is the destruction of company towns. No more company towns. The federal government should give the workers a homestead. Give the workers a homestead in which they own, and they can have a garden and have some hogs and have some milk cows and not be concerned with a company store or a company church or a company school, that all they do is work there. The gospel of property rights will be killed, will be dead, if they have the homesteads. Okay? Have free individual homesteads for your workers. They also want a graduated income tax. They said that tariffs and taxes that Hamilton proposed in the 1790s is old-fashioned, and it's time for an income tax to balance out America's money with an income tax, and they want it graduated. The more you make, the more you pay. The less you make, the less you pay an income tax. Do y'all know in 1913 we started the income tax? It's called the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, and the income tax was graduated, and the wealthy class had to pay a large tax bill, and they got mad about it. And by 1917, Congress started finding loopholes to give these people advantages of not having to pay a tax. I'm like, bring them back on. Make them pay their tax. I pay my $10,000 a year, sometimes $12,000 a year on income tax. And these millionaires get by with paying less than $1,000 a year on income tax. That just tells you something, guys. It's just not fair. And so here they want a graduated income tax, where the wealthy pays more income tax than the poor people do. They also want to end child labor. If you kill child labor, you give adult males jobs. They're giving kids the jobs because the kids can be bullied. Adult males will fight back. That's why a lot of these sweatshops hire young women and children. Kept the men folks out of there. Get rid of child labor, it gives the men lots of jobs to help support their families. If the wife works and the man works, they can usually make it. Get rid of child labor. It'll be 1938 before child labor is done away with in America. Okay? And then they said they want cooperative stores. No more company stores, they want co-ops. The workers will come together and pool their money together and build their own store and get discounted prices. That's what Sam's Club is. That's what Costco's is. You pay $100 a year to get the membership card, and you can buy items in bulk quantity and get it for cheaper prices. I got a couple of friends, we'll get together and pool our money together and go to Sam's and buy what we need, and then come home and divide it up among ourselves. Because I don't need 24 rolls of paper towels at one time. And I sure don't need 50 rolls of toilet paper at one time. That's about a year and a half supply of toilet paper. All right. So, and I don't need to buy all this frozen food and all these canned foods and so forth. All I need is 2 or 3 of them. I don't need to have 24 cans of an item or 12 cans of an item. It'll take me a whole year to go through all this stuff. I have stuff expire before I get a chance to even eat it. So I try to be careful when I go to Sam's when I buy stuff here. But they want the corporate stores to get rid of the company stores so people can buy their produce, can buy their food, their supplies at a cheaper price. And then they call for an 8-hour workday. They said that God created humans in 8-hour intervals, that humans need 8 hours of sleep, 8 hours of play, and 8 hours of work. Why did these industrial leaders work their workers 90 hours a week? Because they didn't want them to have any kind of leisure time. To them, that leisure would mean that they'd get drunk, come to work the next day, and not be able to perform their duties. So they control the workers and their leisure time by giving them no leisure time. And now they are claiming they want 8-hour work days. Well, across the country, workers begin to form what is called 8-hour leagues, 8-hour work leagues. And they decide on May the 4th, 1886, to have a grand meeting in the city of Chicago. Now, here's what's about Chicago. Old Marshall Fields and the Swifts and the Armours and the George Pullmans all got together, and they realized that all the railroads going across the country are a lot going through Chicago. The roads that come out of the South go to Chicago. The ones out of New York and Virginia and on down to Georgia are going to Chicago. The trains from Southern California and Texas and the middle part of the Great Plains are all going to Chicago. So they passed a rule in Chicago that no train could leave the city after 4 o'clock in the afternoon. That all trains had to be held up in Chicago overnight. From 4 o'clock until 6 in the morning, the trains could not move out of Chicago. Now, what does that do for the economy of Chicago? It means all these people traveling by trains, they got to overnight in Chicago. They got to get hotel rooms. They got to eat some food. A lot will go shopping at Marshall Fields. You know, they'll go to the different shops that are on the loop and so forth. And so you got a captive audience of all these people traveling across the country who are now waylaid in Chicago for 12 to 14 hours overnight. Marshall Fields didn't close his store until midnight. And so all these folks will come into Chicago from these various towns. What's the best place to have an 8-hour league meeting? The city of Chicago. You all arrive from across the country. You're there by 4 o'clock. You get your hotel rooms, get your little food to eat, and you make your way down to the Haymarket Square where the big assembly is going to take place for the 8-hour league. And you had several thousand people who came to Chicago on the 4th of May, 1886, for this big, huge 8-hour league meeting. The mayor of Chicago has given these officials of the 8-hour leagues the keys to the city. They have their permits, and they are allowed to have their meeting. The mayor shows up first thing and gives a speech to the crowd. He goes home. While the meeting is being organized and getting started, out over in the Millionaires Club in downtown Chicago are all these men who run Chicago. And they decided to shut down the 8-hour league. Marshall Fields will get all his delivery carts, and he had several dozen delivery carts, because he delivered the items to your house. That's what Amazon's trying to do right now. He hired young men to be his salespeople. When they started losing their looks at around age 25, he made them drivers of delivery carts. and they delivered the goods to the houses. He wanted those good-looking young guys to be the salesmen because they could sell more to the women. That's how come Abercrombie and Finch got those boys standing out front of the store with blue jeans on and not much else, trying to get the women in there to buy stuff. That's how Marshall Fields did his business. Well, these delivery carts had all been returned, and here they loaded up the police department because the police department was in with a bunch of millionaires. And these carts are going to circle the Haymarket Square. The police get out of those carts, and somewhere along the line, a bomb goes off. Several police officers are killed when the bomb goes off. Over a dozen of these people here in the 8-Hour League are wounded in this explosion. And they make war at the Haymarket Square. These innocent people who are here to meet about 8-hour work days are going to be waylaid. The leaders of the 8-Hour League are arrested and charged for being anarchists. Anarchists in the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s were called communists. Today, anarchists are called terrorists. They accuse these leaders of the 8-Hour League of trying to destroy American democracy, trying to destroy laissez-faire capitalism. Several of these guys were executed. The next morning in the Chicago paper, the headline was "The Riot at the Haymarket Square and How the 8-Hour Leaguers Are Terrorists. They're anarchists." And the news goes across the country, and the 8-Hour League is destroyed. Fake news destroyed a labor movement in which the laborers were trying to find protection and trying to find a way to have a suitable life. And they're accused of being terrorists. They're accused of being anarchists here in this time period. Okay? After the Haymarket Square, your states began to create what is called the National Guard. The National Guard was created for no other reason than to put down labor unrest, to put down labor strikes. Okay? So now you have the National Guard, the United States Army, going against labor. The wealthier class are controlling all of the politics here in this time period. Okay? Well, finally comes another gentleman whose name is Samuel Gompers. That's spelled Gompers. Samuel Gompers is going to form what is called the American Federation of Labor. The American Federation of Labor is going to change the way that labor does its job. They realize you cannot have a mass movement, you cannot have marches, you cannot get out there and protest because you have the National Guard and the Army that will come after you. And he tells labor the best way to handle your situation is to hire lawyers. Make the labor movement involve lawyers. Have the labor unions get together and they hire lawyers to represent them in collective bargaining against the lawyers of corporations. Lawyers work with lawyers to make the rules for the working people. And this becomes successful. Collective bargaining becomes a successful way of dealing with labor strife. The laborers get together, they start planning a labor strike, they bring their lawyers into it, tell the lawyers what they want, what their grievances are. The lawyers of labor union will go to the lawyers of industry and try to work out a deal. And then both sides have to vote if they will or will not accept the agreement that the lawyers have made. They both agreed to the rules that were created through the collective bargaining, then you have a suitable solution for labor problems. And this begins to work. Well, guys, the American farmers have the same problems as workers do. They're being cheated by the railroad companies. They're being mistreated by the people who buy their raw materials, who go through and buy their beef and buy their pork and buy their commodities. And they're getting tired of it. In 1867, they formed what is called the Patrons of Husbandry. The patrons of husbandry is also called the Grange, Grange. Oliver Kelly heads up the patrons of husbandry. Okay? And this group begins to identify the thieves of the night, the people who are guilty of stealing from the American farmer. The first one they go after is the railroads. They're charging such high freight rates to carry our goods to the marketplace that we are losing money. We're growing all these crops, raising all this beef and all this pork, but the railroads is getting all the profits. We're getting cents on the dollar, and it's not fair. So therefore, the railroad should go under federal control. They're against the banks. The banks loans us money. When a little recession happens along the way, the banks want all their money back. We sign loans for 30 years, and within 5 years, they want their money back. We've got to find a way to regulate the banking system. They go against the farm equipment people, the people who made tractors and disc plows and all this stuff. Cyrus McCormick and John Deere made tractors in Chicago. But a tractor in Iowa costs more money than a tractor does in Germany. That Chicago-made tractor is going to Germany across the Atlantic Ocean, and they pay less money for a tractor in Germany than the farmers did in Iowa, which is only a couple of 100 miles away. And they're there by train. And so they want to go through and try to find a way to solve the problem with the companies that make farm tools. Okay? They also want company stores. They want co-ops. And today we do have the farmer co-ops. We got a brand new one in Fort Walton Beach that's just opened down on Bill Parkway. And so we want these co-ops here so the farmers can buy items cheaper. And then they want to control over the warehouses and the silos, because they're losing money by housing their crops in silos and in warehouses until the industrial plants can take their items to be processed. Okay? So the patrons of husbandry are going to identify the thieves in the night, the ones that cause the problems here in this time period. Okay? In 1893, we have a Great Depression. 200 railroad companies have given themselves big bonuses and have bankrupted the companies. Because the railroads go under, 15,000 businesses go under. Unemployment in America is 25%. 25% of the American people are unemployed. Now, here's what's important, guys. That 25% are urban people. That is only 40% of the country. Of 40% of the people who live in cities, 25% are unemployed, which means that over half the people have no income coming in if they live in urban areas. Okay? The American farmers took up 60% of the population, but farmers can feed themselves. Farmers have more leeway if they can keep their farms from being foreclosed by the banks. And here the banks found a way to steal their farms back and steal all the crops that are in production on those farms and make a lot more money. It's a mess out here. Okay? Here comes Jacob Coxey. Jacob Coxey wants to have a march on Washington, D.C. He says the American people have got to protest what is going on in America. Now, your president in this time period is Grover Cleveland. He's a Democratic president. And Grover Cleveland will not have anything to do with public works. The American people, especially in the cities, are wanting the federal government to create jobs for them to have during this depression. And like all the other Gilded Age presidents, Grover Cleveland says the depressions come and go, And I will not help the people with public works. I will not give money to the people to help them out. I will not give them stimulus money. I will not help them out. It's terrible, guys. Do y'all know the federal government was so broke they borrowed over $200 million from J.P. Morgan to keep the country afloat? One millionaire is what kept the country afloat. This is crazy in this time period. And here comes Jacob Coxey. He lives out in Ohio, and he plans a march to Washington, D.C. And as he marches, hundreds of people fall in line behind him. He'll have close to 2,000 people with him when he arrives in Washington, D.C. And it's been well publicized in the newspaper about Jacob Coxey's march to Washington, D.C. They arrived on Easter Sunday of 1894. They want to have public works stimulus money for the American people during this depression. When they arrive on the steps of the White House, Pennsylvania Avenue, President Grover Cleveland calls in the Washington, D.C. Police Department and has these people arrested for trespassing on public property. He broke it up with the police department, saying that these folks were trespassing on public property. Have y'all seen that lately in American history? In 1894, George Pullman decided to cut the pay of his workers. George Pullman had promised his investors a 10% return each year on their investment. That means in 10 years, you have doubled your money. And during this depression, he could not guarantee that 10%. So he cut back the wages of his workers. The average worker at the Pullman Train Car Company in 1894 was getting 10 cents a week in pay. And they protested. They went on strike. And George Pullman sent a telegram to his friend Grover Cleveland, the President of the United States, and the President of the United States on July the 4th in the United States Army. The United States Army made war against the workers and the Pullman train car plant. There were 13 workers who died from gunshot wounds, several dozen wounded from gunshot wounds when the United States Army shows up. Labor is in trouble. Labor is in trouble. Something has to be done to keep America from going into a civil war between labor and industrialists. Well, out in the Dakotas is a group of people who come together. They are part of the old grains, the old farmers unions, the farmers associations, and they decided to start a new political party, a party for the people. It's called the People's Party. It is called the Populist Party, and it comes out of South Dakota. And this party is going to burn across the upper Great Plains, and it's going to come into the American South. Texas, the American South, Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Kansas, Oklahoma, Colorado, Iowa, Montana, Wyoming, Nebraska. All these farmers get involved in the Farmers Alliance, who are going to form what is called the Populist Party. The Populist Party. Here is their agenda. The government owns all the railroad companies. Railroads do not charge freight. All the shipping is free because it's owned by the federal government. The banks are controlled by the federal government. They cannot foreclose on the people during times of financial crisis. They want the telegraph lines controlled by the federal government. They want the newspapers controlled by the federal government. They want all the landholding companies controlled by the federal government. They want a graduated income tax. They want an 8-hour workday. They want profit sharing for industrial workers. They want restriction on immigration, so that the American people who are citizens can get the jobs. Don't have the poor immigrants who can get lower pay. Have the American workers get those jobs. They want public works during depressions, and they want to expand the American currency. The American currency is based on the gold standard. They want silver added to the gold. They wanted silver added to the gold. The Populist Party has also got a companion party that is divided by Jim Crow laws. The black farmers want the same thing the white farmers want. And the black farmers and the white farmers want to combine together to form this big populist party. Guys, if these farmers join together and bring in the shopkeepers and bring in the people who are being affected by the wealthy class, this party could control up to 70% of the elections. But you look at these demands here and you realize this is socialism. This is heading toward communism. You don't want the federal government controlling all these different operations. You want to be controlled by the people. Let the people control them in a responsible manner. Don't give it over to the federal government to control. Okay? In 1896, they decided to run a gentleman for the presidency of the United States. The man they chose was 36 years old. His name was William Jennings Bryan, B-R-Y-A-N. Mr. Bryan is known as being a great communicator. He's really good at debating. He's known as a well-known orator. And they want him to run for the presidency. So the Populist Party will choose William Jennings Bryan to run for the presidency. The Republican Party, who's controlled by big business, is going to choose William McKinley to run for the presidency. William McKinley is going to represent big business. The Democratic Party couldn't decide on who they wanted to run, and they decided to run William Jennings Bryan. Mr. Bryan is going to run for two parties, the Democratic Party and the Populist Party. And by doing so, he splits the vote, and big business under William McKinley will win the election. They are no better off than they were before. The Populist Party is going to meet its doom when William Jennings Bryan decides to run for both parties. That is just totally crazy. It's totally crazy. This is 1896. At the same time all this is taking place, out of New Orleans comes a court case that involves Homer Plessy. Homer Plessy is a gentleman who lives in New Orleans, whose appearance is that of a white man, but his DNA is African. In Louisiana in 1893, they passed a Jim Crow law for the railroad trains. And they said that black folks did not ride on white train cars. And Homer Plessy decides to test the law. And he boards a white train car. Well, guys, they don't know he's black until the porter comes around. Most of your porters were black gentlemen. The railroads hired black men as porters because they consider porters, black men, the best ones to serve white folks. A racist attitude towards your porters. Now, if you are a porter on the railroad, you do make pretty good money. Some of your best earning salaries for African-American men were working for the railroad companies, mainly as porters or mechanics. All right. So the porter on board the train knew Homer and he ratted him out. And the conductor throws is going to throw Homer Plessy off the train and have him arrested by the New Orleans Police Department. He is charged for breaking the Jim Crow laws of the city of New Orleans, and it goes to court in New Orleans. The judge is named Ferguson. The court case is called Homer Plessy versus Ferguson. And in New Orleans, he's found guilty of violating the train car laws. The court case is appealed to the Louisiana State Supreme Court in Baton Rouge. And up here in Baton Rouge, the Louisiana Supreme Court finds Mr. Plessy guilty of violating the train car laws. A group of black reformers come in and sponsor him and gets a court case to the American Supreme Court. It arrives in 1896, right in the middle of the Populist Party, discussing that big merger between black voters and white voters. And those 9 judges on the Supreme Court, 8 of them, 8 judges on the Supreme Court, are going to uphold the Louisiana findings against Homer Plessy. One judge, whose name is Judge Harlan, Harlan, Judge Harlan, who is from Kentucky, the only Southerner on the Supreme Court. Mr. Harlan says the American law is colorblind. That Homer Plessy does have the right to ride on this train car as an American citizen. He's the only one who went for the Plessy case. The other 8 judges found it that Jim Crow is now the law of the land. Yes, people, Jim Crow goes across the country. You have black restaurants and white restaurants and train stations and barber shops in Denver, San Francisco, Seattle, Portland, San Diego, LA, Boston, Providence, Hartford, Detroit, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Chicago, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, St. Paul. Jim Crow goes nationwide with the Plessy case. And you're going to have separate but equal go across the country. With the Plessy case in 1896, the American people are going to declare the American South has finally won Civil War. They did it through the Supreme Court. Y'all remember, guys, in 1856, when Roger Taney, the old Supreme Court Chief Justice, declared that slavery was the law of the land during the Dred Scott case? Well, here you are again. A conservative Supreme Court makes a ruling that allows Jim Crow to go across the country. You've got to be careful of who are put on the Supreme Court. They should not be political positions. They should take care of the American people. And by passing the Plessy case, the Supreme Court has just said that black voters and white voters cannot come together and form a political party. It keeps the Republican Party and the Democratic Party as your 2 major parties in American politics. It does get pretty crazy in American politics. And now the Supreme Court is wrapped up in it here. Okay? It's wrapped up in it here. Well, there's a gentleman who lives out here in this part of the world who's from New York State. He's a writer. He got a job with the Aberdeen paper in South Dakota. He was there when the populist movement was getting its footing, getting started. After several years, he goes to the Chicago Tribune, where he's a reporter for the political scenes. He goes to St. Louis during the convention for the Populist Party, and he knows all about the populists. And he decides to write a book that's going to describe the populist. The book is called The Wizard of Oz. It's a political satire over American politics. Over American politics. Okay? I want you guys, after I give you all this lecture, to go to your lecture notes and reread all these characters who are in this book and what they represent in the book. And then I want you guys to go through and rewatch the movie. And see all that you can identify in The Wizard of Oz that deals with American politics and American society. Okay? The main person in the book is Dorothy. She's an average, level-headed American. She can think for herself. She's educated. She's going to school. The movie begins with her returning home from school. On the way home, she goes by Mrs. Glutch's place. Mrs. Glutch is an old landowner. She owns half the county, and everybody reports to her because she's a matron of the county. She controls everybody and everything, including the sheriff and the court system. And she is mad because Dorothy's dog, Toto, who is a teetotaler, he's part of the prohibitionists, has gotten into her garden and chased her old cat. And Mrs. Glutch wants that dog arrested and done away with. Toto is heading to the convict lease system, guys. They're going to lock his little butt up and make you go through and clean the roadways. Clean out those ditches. Fill in those potholes. Toto is a sentenced person here, guys. And Dorothy wants to save him. And she decides after encountering with the woman, and the woman takes the dog off on her bicycle, and Toto's smarter than Mrs. Glutch is. He escapes and goes back to the house. Dorothy gathers him up and she heads off. She's like those children who are heading to urban centers trying to find a new life. She's heading to the YWCA. Dorothy gets down the road about a mile or two. She runs into a carnival man, a man who is a psychic. He can tell the future. And of course, he talks to her for a little bit. Toto is going to steal a hot dog from him. And they go into his cabin, into his wagon for a psychic reading. Your mom and your daddy already told you guys, don't go with strangers into houses. And here this crazy girl goes in with a stranger that nobody knows who he is or what he can do to her. And he tells her to close her eyes. And while her eyes are closed, he goes to her purse and he finds a picture of Aunt M. Aunt M is a guardian to Dorothy. Dorothy could have been an orphan trained child that was adopted by this family to help around the house. She might have been from New York City that Charles Brace sent out on the trains to try to find a better place to live. And a lot of kids did go to Kansas. Here, this gentleman sees the picture of Aunt M standing in front of that white picket fence, and he puts the picture back in her purse, and he tells her to open her eyes, and he gets his crystal ball out. He's got his hands going over it and all this stuff. And he says, I see a woman who's got a calico dress on. Her face is very heavy from hard work. In other words, she's got lots of wrinkles. She's really worn down from hard work. And she's standing in front of a white picket fence trying to call for somebody. And Dorothy realizes that Aunt M is looking for her. And she doesn't want to break Aunt M's heart. So she takes off running back to the house. Okay? Aunt M is 35 years old, but she appears to be 60 years old because of hard work. Uncle M, that is right name. I got Uncle Henry. Get the right name here. Uncle Henry is a farmer who got this land from the Homestead Act. He got that 160 acres. He had to go through and build the fences and build the barns and build the houses, live there for 5 years and get it all for free. But the price has been heavy. He's 45 years old. He looks like he's 80 years old. Hard work has aged both Aunt M and Uncle Henry. They have 3 farm hands on the place. And these three farm hands represent sharecroppers. They're trying to help out on the land for a little bit of money that could come their way from hard work. Well, as Dorothy makes her way back to that little family grouping, in the distance comes a twister. Here comes a tornado. And I want to tell you something. MGMs did a great job in creating that twister in 1937 with no special effects as you would have on your computers today. This was all hand done. And the special effects of these 1930 movies, these 1940 movies, makes it worth your time to watch them. There are some wonderful scenes in these movies that were done by trickery with film. Like the city of Atlanta being burned by William Sherman and going with the wind. And you think the whole city is being burned up by how they did the special effects here in these movies. And that twister is getting closer and closer. Aunt Em, Uncle Henry, and the three farmhands have got into the root cellar. They have closed the door. The wind is so loud they cannot hear anybody from the outside. Dorothy comes in as a twister is approaching the property, and her only chance for survival is to get in the house. She goes in the house, and the window frame comes out of the building and hits her on the side of the head and knocks her out. Dorothy has got a brain injury. She goes into this dreamlike state. A lot of folks said she actually died in the movie, that she was resurrected at the end of the movie, that she had gone to heaven. The reason I tell you all this is because L. Frank Baum believed all this stuff. He believed that when you died, you go to heaven and experience it and then come back. His mother-in-law had some real spiritual, interesting theories that dealt with the afterlife and so forth. So a lot of this book is based on the personal beliefs and the religious theology that L. Frank Baum had. And Dorothy is going to be sucked up into this tornado. Now, y'all know that tornadoes do suck up buildings. They suck up cars. They suck up cows. And in the way up in this tornado, she saw chickens and she saw old Miss Grump and all these people, Glutch, all these people in that tornado. And then the building falls to the ground. Dorothy has come out of a world of black and white. The black and white world of Dorothy is an Old Testament America, an old, hard life to row America. When she opens the door, the world goes into color. She has transited from an old world to a new world. She steps out of the house. She hears some giggling, but she does not see anybody. She goes up to the head of a fountain where she stands to survey her surroundings, to see where she's located. Have you ever noticed how older people go to Walmart and they'll get to the front door and stop? And you're trying to get in and they have called everybody, they're holding everybody up. They're trying to get their bearings in that store to figure out which way they need to go. And it's like, y'all just go on. If you find your way around here, y'all just go on and get out of the way. Don't stop here and stand for 5 minutes looking around. My parents were bad about doing that. I'm like, y'all come on. Don't stand here looking around the store. That's what Dorothy did. She's surveying what's around her. And out of the north comes a large bubble. And in this bubble is Glinda, the good witch of the north. Glinda is the witch that killed slavery. The people that she saved are there in that area where Dorothy is. And Glinda invites them to come out and to meet the woman who saved them. The Munchkin people are the former slaves. Then Dorothy is informed that she has killed somebody when the house fell on her. The person she killed was a wicked witch of the East, the witch of slavery. And that witch is wearing silver slippers. Guys, remember the Populist Party wanted silver with the gold. You have the Golden Brick Road and you have the silver slippers. Well, in the first takes of the movie, Louis B. Mayer, the head of MGM Studios, did not like those silver slippers, and he wanted to try out some ruby red slippers. And so the movie went with ruby red slippers on the yellow brick road, where it should have been silver slippers of the silver currency going on the road of the gold currency. And Dorothy receives these silver slippers, or these ruby slippers in the movie. And all of a sudden, here appears the Wicked Witch of the West. She's just gotten word that her sister has died. And she wants to take the life of Dorothy and Toto and destroy them for killing her sister. And Glinda makes sure those ruby red slippers are glued to the feet of Dorothy. They will not come off. And so the Wicked Witch of the West begins to hatch out her plan of how to kill Dorothy and get back those slippers. Become the most powerful person there is. Well, the witch disappears into the ground with a big, huge flame of fire. And then Glinda begins to introduce the little people, the Munchkin people, to Dorothy. And you realize that these people are also your poor people. They're the people who worked in sweatshops. You have the various guilds. You have the Lollipop Guild. You had all these different guilds here that introduced themselves to Dorothy. And you realize these people are not only the Munchkin people, they're also the people caught in industrial slavery. That these people are still being enslaved through sharecropping and the convict lease system and the mill towns and the mining camps and the railroad towns and the sweatshops. And Dorothy says, how can I help all these people? And Glinda says, you've got to go to the Emerald City and see the great and powerful Wizard of Oz. And how do I get there? You follow the yellow brick road. And Dorothy takes off on the yellow brick road. She comes to a crossroads where she sees a big cornfield. And in that cornfield is a scarecrow. This scarecrow has been hung out to dry. And he is going to holler out to Dorothy to get him off that post. And she bends the nail down, and the scarecrow comes jumping out into the road, dancing and prancing around. That scarecrow is the American farmer. The American farmer has been hung out to dry by these industrial plants who make their farm equipment, by the railroads who steal the freight rates on their produce to give them no money in return. And the scarecrow tells Dorothy, I am so muddle-headed that I need a brain. And Dorothy says, you come with me and I will get you a brain from the wizard. If you get me home to Kansas, I will get you a brain. And off the road they go. They come to a little milling village. There's a mill there, a water run mill. There's apple trees there. Dorothy sees the apple trees. The apples are nice and ripe, and she decides she wants one because she's hungry. And she goes and she picks an apple off that tree, and that tree gets mad. He slaps her on the hand. And the tree says, who are you stealing my fruit? This is my fruit. It's for me, not for you. And the scarecrow says, you pick at him, and he'll throw you all the apples that you want. And she says, oh, your old apples are full of worms anyway. And they run down the road as the apple tree throws apples out, and they start gathering up apples. These apple trees are industrialists who do not want to share their profits with their workers. But if the workers irritate them, they will give them some profit sharing. And those apples being thrown to Dorothy is part of a wage that she has earned for working in that industrial plant. It represents profit share. And during this fleeing from the apple tree, throwing apples at them, they run into the edge of the woods and run headlong into a Tin Man. The Tin Man had once been a full human, and industrialization had took away his body parts until he had no heart. He had no heart. The Depression had come and rained on the Tin Man, and he was totally frozen. And from deep inside the Tin Man, they heard the words, oil me, oil me. And they find on the stump an oil can, and they start clicking oil all over the Tin Man. He starts getting loosened up. He blows his whistle through his hat. He starts singing and dancing. And he tells Dorothy and the scarecrow, if you can get home to Kansas and you can get a brain, can I get a heart? And Dorothy says, we'll try. Let's go to the Wizard of Oz. Dorothy's little band of people being gathered up along the roadway represents Coxey's army heading to the Emerald City, heading to Washington, D.C. The road is going to change into a kind of a swampy area, kind of a jungly area. And here a lion pops out. This lion has no courage. He's got a great roar, but no courage. This lion is going to be William Jennings Bryan, the politician, the populist politician. And he tells them that he needs courage. And they said, you come with me and we will take care of this. Okay, along the whole way, the Wicked Witch of the West has been watching them, but Glinda's been protecting them. Y'all remember the poppy fields, and they all fall asleep in the poppy fields, and how Glinda makes it snow so they can get out of the poppy fields? She's being guarded here, guys. When they arrive to the Emerald City, they will not let them in until they see the Wicked Witch on her broomstick that says, or is riding across the sky, surrender Dorothy. And they let her in. They put her on a wagon that is being pulled by horses of many colors. The man who led her into the capital city represents the police that try to run the people off out of Washington, D.C. during Cox's army. They decided it'd be best to let them in. The horses of many colors are your politicians. They tell you one thing, then they change your colors. They turn blue and yellow and pink and purple and so forth. Then they're delivered to be cleaned up. Dorothy gets a new clean dress, gets her shoes polished, gets her hair fixed. Toto gets all groomed up. The Cowardly Lion gets groomed. They put a ribbon in his hair. The Scarecrow gets restuffed, and the Tin Man gets polished. They head down that long hallway to see the Wizard of Oz. And all he is smoke and bluff and blunder. And he tells them, I will not help you until you get the broomstick of the Wicked Witch of the West. And when they leave the Emerald City, they're going down highways and roads past Indian Pass to get there. They're the Mormon people trying to get to Salt Lake City. They're the people on the overland trails trying to get to Idaho to make their way to California or to the Oregon country. There's no good roads. The witch's castle is in the Grand Canyon. And when they get about a mile from the castle, there's a sign that says, if I was you, I'd go back. Witch's castle 1 mile. If I was you, I'd go back. Well, the Wicked Witch is watching them progress through this wilderness, getting to her house. And so she calls in her flying monkeys to go and capture Dorothy and Toto and bring them to her castle. She has plans to destroy them. These people, the flying monkeys, are the once proud people of the Great Plains that the United States Cavalry has captured. The Wicked Witch of the West has captured the Native Americans, and they are the flying monkeys. They fly in, they get a hold of Toto and hold of Dorothy, they fly them out, and then a bunch stays behind to tear up the Scarecrow and scare the bejesus out of the Cowardly Lion and to knock over the Tin Man. And they're left there scrambling, trying to get up. They have no courage, they have no heart, they have no mind, no brains. But yet the three of them come together and make their way across those mountains down to the castle's porch. And down here is the witch's army, the cavalry that is marching. Oh, y'all know all this stuff? And the three characters are going to waylay 3 of these cavalrymen and steal their uniforms and make their way into the castle as the army marches into the castle for the evening. And here they're going to find Dorothy. And they try to start a chase trying to get out of the castle. And they get cornered in one of the towers here in the castle. And the Wicked Witch says, I am going to destroy all of you, beginning with the Scarecrow. And she takes her broom and she lights it in the fire, and she puts the broom on the arm of the Scarecrow. Dorothy, trying to save her friend, sees a pail of water on the windowsill. She grabs it and to pour the water onto the Scarecrow, but she misses, and she drowns the Wicked Witch of the West. And she begins to melt. What killed the Wicked Witch of the West is American water policies. Irrigation, digging those deep wells in the middle part of the Great Plains, and building those grand canals and those brand new dams in Southern California and Arizona and in Nevada. The Wicked Witch of the West was killed by water policies. So, guys, you've got a story here that deals with the Wizard of Oz as a political satire for the Populist Party in this time period. I want you guys to now go to your lecture notes, go to lecture number 4, and find the description of the Wizard of Oz toward the back end of those notes, and y'all read through them. Okay? Well, my time is up for this lecture. I got a little bit more to cover. I'm going to just put that in the next one. And I will see you guys later.